What if everything you thought you knew about the beginning of civilization was built on sand? What if the monuments we call ancient were actually late arrivals to a story already thousands of years old? In the desert of southern Iraq, beneath tells that rise like sleeping giants from the plain, archaeologists uncovered something that rewrites the very concept of the dawn of history. Cities, temples, writing, astronomy, all of it flourishing when the Nile Valley was still scattered camps of hunter-gatherers, when the plateau of Giza was empty, windswept stone, waiting for a future that wouldn't arrive for another 2,000 years. The Great Pyramid of Khufu has stood as the symbol of ancient achievement for so long that we've forgotten to ask the question that changes everything. What came before? What civilizations had already risen, built their temples, mapped the stars, and pressed their knowledge into clay tablets while Egypt was still learning to farm? So before the story pulls you under, take a moment to like this video and hit subscribe, but only if you're drawn to histories that unravel the timeline we thought we understood. And if you're still here, tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is there. I want to imagine this ancient knowledge stretching across the world, connecting us all in the dark. Tonight, we're going back further than the pyramids, back to cities that were already ancient when Egypt was young, back to the Sumerians and the civilization that history almost forgot. The Great Pyramid of Khufu was completed around 2560 BCE, a date established through astronomical alignment, historical records, and archaeological evidence that leaves little room for doubt. For centuries, this monument has represented the pinnacle of ancient achievement, the beginning of monumental civilization, the dawn of human ambition made stone. But here's what they don't tell you in school, what gets buried in the footnotes of archaeological reports. When those limestone blocks were being dragged across the Giza plateau, when Egyptian workers were mixing mortar and calculating angles, there were already cities in Mesopotamia that had been continuously inhabited for 3,000 years. 3,000 years! Let that sink in as you drift towards sleep. Imagine standing at the base of the Great Pyramid on the day it was completed, looking up at smooth white limestone casing stones that gleamed in the Egyptian sun, a monument so massive and so perfect that it seemed to defy human capability. The pharaoh's architects had calculated angles with precision that still impresses modern engineers. They had organized thousands of workers into teams that moved 2 million plus blocks of stone, some weighing as much as 15 tons, with nothing but copper tools, wooden sledges, and human determination. It was, by any measure, a triumph of engineering, mathematics, and sheer will, a civilization announcing to the cosmos that humanity had arrived, that we could build something that would last forever. But while that pyramid was being built, while Egypt was experiencing what scholars call the Old Kingdom, the Golden Age when pharaohs were gods and monuments were promises of eternity, scribes in the city of Uruk were cataloguing tablets in temple libraries that their ancestors had written 1,000 years before. Priests in Eridu were maintaining temples built on foundations laid 2,000 years earlier. Merchants in Ur were using commercial contracts and mathematical systems that had been refined over centuries of trade. The Sumerians weren't just older than Egypt's monuments. They were older than Egypt's concept of itself as a civilization. The mathematics tells the story more clearly than any mythology could. If you were born in 2560 BCE, the year the Great Pyramid was completed, and you decided to travel back in time to the founding of Eridu, you would need to journey back 3,000 years. That's the same distance in time between us and the fall of Rome. It's the same chronological gulf that separates us from the height of the Roman Empire, when Latin was still a living language, and Mediterranean trade routes connected an empire that stretched from Britain to Mesopotamia. Imagine that span. Now imagine cities, temples, writing, astronomy, mathematics. All of it already functioning, already sophisticated, already ancient by the time Egypt started building its first true pyramid. The timeline fractures our comfortable narratives about how civilization develops. We want progression, a clean story of humans slowly learning, slowly building, slowly accumulating knowledge until we reach the sophistication necessary for monumental architecture and urban planning. But the archaeological record doesn't cooperate with that story. It shows us cities appearing in Mesopotamia thousands of years before comparable development anywhere else, as if someone had compressed the entire process of civilization building into a few centuries and then pressed play while the rest of the world was still figuring out farming. Textbooks show the pyramids as the dawn of ancient history, the beginning of the story we tell about human achievement. But they're actually a middle chapter, built by a civilization that was learning from cultures that had already been writing, building, trading, and watching the stars for millennia. The Egyptians were brilliant, make no mistake. They created wonders that still stagger the imagination, but they created them in a world where civilization was already old, where the templates for urban life and monumental architecture had been established, tested, refined, and passed down through generations of Mesopotamian builders who left their knowledge pressed into clay tablets that would survive longer than any pyramid. So when you picture ancient history tonight, as you drift towards sleep, adjust the timeline in your mind, push it back, way back, before the pyramids, before hieroglyphs, before pharaohs claimed divinity, back to a time when the first cities were rising from the Mesopotamian plain, when the first temples were being oriented to the stars, when the first scribes were learning that marks pressed into clay could preserve thoughts across time and distance. That's where civilization begins, in Sumer, in cities whose ruins would be ancient by the time Egypt started dreaming of eternity. It began, as these stories often do, with fragments. In the mid-19th century, European archaeologists digging in the ruins of what would become Iraq started finding clay tablets covered in wedge-shaped marks that no one could read. They were beautiful, precise, clearly writing of some kind, but the language was unknown, the script indecipherable. Henry Rawlinson, working from inscriptions carved into cliff faces to Persia, began the slow work of cracking the code of cuneiform. And what emerged from those tablets was a civilization that predated anything the classical world had remembered, a people who called themselves the Black-Headed Ones, who built cities when the rest of the world was still learning what a city could be. Picture the scene, tell after tell rising from the Iraqi desert, artificial hills built from thousands of years of human occupation, each layer representing a different century, a different generation, a different chapter of continuous habitation. British and French archaeologists, working in brutal heat with minimal funding and maximum ambition, began systematic excavations in the 1850s and 60s. At Nineveh, at Nimrud, at Babylon, they found tablets by the thousands, whole libraries pressed into clay and baked hard by the same fires that destroyed the buildings that housed them. But the writing was alien, completely unlike anything known from Greek or Roman sources. The symbols looked like wedges pressed into soft material, systematic and precise, clearly a writing system, but one that had been forgotten for 2,000 years. Rawlinson, a British army officer who had spent years in Persia, became obsessed with the trilingual inscriptions at Behistun, carved into a cliff face at the order of the Persian king Darius the Great. The same text appeared 3 times in 3 different scripts, Old Persian, Elamite, and the mysterious wedge writing that appeared on the tablets flooding out of Mesopotamian excavations. Working from the Persian version, which could be partially understood through its connection to known languages, Rawlinson began the painstaking work of decipherment. Each word was a puzzle, each grammatical structure a mystery to be solved through comparison, pattern recognition, and brilliant guesswork that turned out to be correct far more often than it should have been. By the 1850s, the basic structure of cuneiform had been cracked. The wedge marks weren't alphabetic, weren't quite syllabic, but a complex mixture of sound, signs and meaning signs that could represent whole words or parts of words depending on context. And as scholars began reading the tablets in earnest, what emerged was staggering. These weren't just administrative records, though there were plenty of those, lists of grain and oil and livestock that documented the economic machinery of ancient cities. These were also literary works, astronomical observations, mathematical tables, medical texts, legal codes, religious hymns, and historical chronicles. An entire civilization revealed itself through clay, speaking across millennia in a voice that had been silent since the script was forgotten around the 1st century CE. But it was the language beneath the cuneiform that truly shook the archaeological world. The tablets from the latest periods, from the 1st millennium BCE, were written in Akkadian, a Semitic language related to Hebrew and Arabic. Scholars could work with could find cognates and grammatical structures that made sense in the context of known language families. But the older tablets, the ones from the deepest excavation levels, were written in something completely different. A language unrelated to any known linguistic group, agglutinative and bizarre, with grammatical structures that looked like nothing else on Earth. They called it Sumerian after Sumer, the ancient name for southern Mesopotamia that appeared in later historical texts. The Sumerians themselves emerged from clay and fragments, like a photograph developing in the slow motion. They built cities called Uruk, Ur, Eridu, Lagash, Nippur. They worshipped gods named Enlil, Enki, Inanna, Anu. They had kings with names like Gilgamesh and Lugalbanda, whose exploits filled epic poems copied and recopied for thousands of years. They invented writing around 3200 BCE, not to preserve poetry or religion, but to track commercial transactions, to record how much barley went into the temple storehouse and how much beer came out. The poetry came later, once they realized that marks in clay could preserve anything, including the voice of a king who wanted his deeds remembered forever. As more tablets were translated through the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the chronological picture became clearer and more disturbing to established historical narratives. The Sumerians weren't a Bronze Age people contemporary with early Egypt. They were older, much older. Their cities had been flourishing for 1,000 years before Egypt unified under the first pharaohs. Their writing predated hieroglyphs by at least a century, maybe more. Their astronomical observations recorded planetary movements that wouldn't be matched for mathematical precision until the Greeks learned Babylonian methods in the classical period. Everything archaeology was uncovering in Mesopotamia was pushing the origin of civilization further back, deeper into a past that ancient historians like Herodotus and Strabo hadn't even known existed. The tablets kept coming. Every excavation produced more, until museums in London, Paris, Berlin, and Philadelphia had collections numbering in the hundreds of thousands, and the majority of them still sit untranslated, waiting in storage for scholars with the linguistic training to read Sumerian and the patience to work through administrative records from cities that fell into ruin 4,000 years ago. Each tablet is a voice, each one a fragment of the world's first complex civilization, speaking to us if we'll listen, telling us that history is older and stranger than we ever imagined. 6,000 years ago, give or take a few centuries, at a place the Sumerians called Eridu, something remarkable happened. Archaeologists excavating the site in the 1940s and 50s, digging down through layer after layer of occupation, found the remains of a temple built around 5400 BCE. Beneath it, another temple, and beneath that, another. 18 successive temples, each built on the ruins of the last, stretching back into a time so remote that it makes the pyramids feel almost modern. The earlier structures were simple reed huts transformed into permanent architecture. But even in those primitive buildings, the layout was already sacred, already oriented, already part of a religious tradition that would endure for millennia. Fuad Safar and Seton Lloyd, the archaeologists who excavated Eridu on behalf of the Iraqi Directorate General of Antiquities in the late 1940s, must have felt like time travellers as they dug deeper into the tell. Each metre down was another few centuries back, each architectural level a chapter in a story that kept getting older. The later temples were substantial structures, mud brick platforms supporting sanctuaries decorated with elaborate architectural features, evidence of wealth and sophisticated building techniques. But what struck them, what still resonates through their excavation reports, was the continuity. The same spot, used for the same sacred purpose, rebuilt again and again across thousands of years. Imagine a religious tradition so stable, so deeply rooted, that a temple destroyed by time or flood or fire would be rebuilt on exactly the same foundation, maintaining the sacred geography across generations who might not even remember the names of the ancestors who laid the first stones. The earliest temples down at the bottom of the stratigraphic sequence were almost laughably simple. Rectangular structures maybe 10 feet by 15 feet, built with reed bundles set into the ground and plastered with mud, what archaeologists call wattle and daub construction. But even these simple buildings had features that would become standard in Sumerian temple architecture. A central niche in one wall for the cult statue, an offering table positioned to receive gift from worshippers, doorways oriented to catch the prevailing breeze and, possibly, aligned to celestial phenomena that mattered to the priests who served there. The sophistication wasn't in the materials or the construction technique. It was in the intention, the understanding that this was a place where earth and heaven met, where the god could descend and humans could offer reverence. As you move up through the temple sequence, through the centuries of rebuilding, you watch architecture evolve. Reed structures give way to mud brick. Simple rectangular buildings develop side rooms, interior courtyards, elaborate facades. By temple level 7, dated to around 5000 BCE, you're looking at substantial architecture with decorated walls, built-in altars, and evidence of complex ritual activity. By temple 12, around 4500 BCE, the structures are monumental, built on raised platforms to lift them above the surrounding settlement, visible statements of sacred space and religious authority. The final temples, from the early 3rd millennium BCE, are massive complexes that would eventually develop into the ziggurat tradition, those stepped pyramids that dominated Mesopotamian skylines and rivaled anything Egypt would build. But it's the continuity that haunts the imagination. 18 temples, each built on the ruins of the last, each maintaining the sacred function across changes in building materials, architectural sophistication, and probably political organization. The people who built Temple 1, that simple reed structure in the early 6th millennium BCE, couldn't have imagined Temple 18, the elaborate complex that stood 3,000 years later. But they started something that would endure, that would survive floods and invasions and the rise and fall of dynasties, something that mattered enough to be preserved and rebuilt and maintained across a span of time longer than all of recorded Egyptian history. Eridu wasn't unique in its longevity, but it was special in Sumerian religious thought. Later texts call it the first city, the place where civilization was lowered from heaven, where Enki, the god of wisdom and fresh water, established his temple and taught humans the arts of civilization. Whether this reflects genuine historical memory or mythological elaboration is impossible to say, but the archaeological evidence shows that Eridu was indeed ancient by Sumerian standards, that it had been a sacred center for millennia before the first Egyptian pharaohs claimed divinity. When the pyramids were being built, Eridu's temple complex was already maintaining a tradition that stretched back 3,000 years, rebuilt on foundations that had been sacred since before anyone learned to write, before anyone thought to preserve their knowledge in any form more permanent than oral tradition and the careful training of each generation of priests. And here's what keeps you awake, or should, as you drift towards sleep. If Eridu was this old, if it represented a continuous religious tradition stretching back into the Neolithic, what came before? What inspired that first simple temple, that first conscious decision to build a permanent structure for worship, rather than simply using a natural feature or a temporary shrine? The answer lies buried in earlier periods, in settlements we're only beginning to understand, in a past that gets deeper and stranger the more we dig. Picture the Nile Valley in 5400 BCE. Small settlements along the riverbank. People just beginning to experiment with agriculture. Scattered communities without writing, without monumental architecture, without the organizational complexity that would eventually birth the pharaohs. Now picture southern Mesopotamia at the same moment. Eridu already a sacred center, Uruk beginning its long rise toward urban magnificence, a network of settlements connected by trade routes and shared religious practice. The contrast is staggering. While Egypt was still in its Neolithic phase, Mesopotamia was inventing civilization itself, developing the templates that the rest of the world would eventually follow. The archaeological evidence from Egypt in the mid-6th millennium BCE shows us small villages, circular huts made of reed and mud, populations living primarily on wild resources supplemented by early farming. They made pottery, yes, but each community had its own traditions, its own styles, without the cultural unity that would mark later periods. They buried their dead in simple graves with minimal grave goods, suggesting social structures that were relatively egalitarian, without the sharp class divisions that come with urban civilization. They had no writing, no monumental architecture, no evidence of the kind of central authority that could organize large-scale construction projects or maintain long-distance trade networks. They were, in the terminology of archaeology, still Neolithic, still in the long, slow transition from mobile hunter-gatherers to settled agricultural communities. Meanwhile, in Mesopotamia, Eridu's temple complex was entering its 7th or 8th rebuilding, a substantial structure that required coordinated labor, centralized planning, and religious authority capable of commanding community resources. Uruk was growing from a village into something larger, a proto-urban center that would explode into full urbanism within a few centuries. The Ubaid culture, which we'll explore in a moment, had spread across the entire region, creating a shared pottery tradition, shared religious practices, and evidence of trade networks that moved goods across hundreds of miles. The organizational complexity was already there. The social hierarchies, the specialized labor, the surplus production necessary to feed non-farming specialists like priests and craftsmen. All the pieces of urban civilization were in place, waiting to coalesce into the cities that would define Sumerian culture. The difference wasn't environmental. Egypt had the Nile, perhaps the most predictable and generous river system in the ancient world, flooding annually with perfect regularity, depositing rich silt that made farming almost effortless. Mesopotamia had the Tigris and Euphrates, unpredictable rivers that could flood catastrophically or fail to flood at all, requiring irrigation systems, water management, and constant vigilance just to maintain agricultural production. If environmental determinism was the primary factor in civilization development, Egypt should have urbanized first. But it didn't. Mesopotamia had something else. Some combination of cultural innovation, social organization, and perhaps sheer luck that pushed them toward complexity earlier than any comparable region. By 5000 BCE, when Eridu's temples were already ancient, Egypt was just beginning the slow process that would eventually lead to the pre-dynastic period, the centuries of gradual development that preceded the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt under the first pharaohs around 3100 BCE. Those pre-dynastic centuries saw the emergence of more complex settlements, the development of social hierarchies, the first experiments with monumental architecture, but they were following patterns that Mesopotamia had already established, solving problems that Sumerian city dwellers had already confronted and resolved centuries earlier. The wheel, the plough, standardized weights and measures, centralized grain storage, all of it developed first in Mesopotamia and spread outward, carried by trade and cultural exchange into regions that were just beginning to imagine what urban life could look like. This isn't to diminish Egyptian achievement. The civilization that would build the pyramids, that would create hieroglyphic writing and mummification and the elaborate theology of the afterlife, was brilliant and original. But it wasn't first. It developed in a world where cities already existed, where writing had already been invented, where other cultures had already demonstrated that large populations could be organized, fed, and governed. Egypt perfected many things, created wonders unique in human history, but the fundamental innovations, the base technologies of civilization, those came from Mesopotamia. The Sumerians wrote the first draft of urban civilization, and everyone else, including Egypt, revised and refined it. Archaeologists call it the Ubaid period, a span of time from roughly 6500 to 3800 BCE, when southern Mesopotamia saw the emergence of the world's first complex society. The name comes from Tel al-Ubaid, a site near Ur where distinctive pottery first identified this culture, but the Ubaid stretched across the entire region, a cultural horizon that predates anything recognizable as Egyptian civilization by thousands of years. The pottery is beautiful, painted with geometric designs in dark pigment on a light background, and it appears in settlement after settlement, evidence of shared culture, trade networks, and social organization that was already sophisticated when the pyramids were still an impossible dream. Harry Reginald Howell, working in the early 20th century, first identified the Ubaid layers beneath Sumerian sites, recognizing that this distinctive pottery represented a cultural period earlier than anything then known. Later excavations at Tel al-Ubaid itself and at dozens of other sites across Mesopotamia revealed the extent of this culture. It wasn't localized to a single city or region. It stretched from the Persian Gulf north to the Turkish border, from the Zagros Mountains west to the Syrian desert. This represented a unified cultural horizon, communities sharing pottery styles, architectural traditions, religious practices, and probably language across an area the size of California. In the mid-6th millennium BCE, when Egypt was still a patchwork of isolated villages, Mesopotamia was already culturally integrated, already functioning as a coherent region with shared identity and interconnected settlements. The Ubaid wasn't urban in the sense that later Sumerian cities would be. The settlements were villages, maybe a few thousand people at most, clustered around temples that served as religious centers and probably economic hubs for their regions. But the villages were permanent, built with substantial architecture that was meant to last. The irrigation systems, simple at first but growing more sophisticated through time, allowed agricultural surplus that freed some people from farming to become craftsmen, priests, or administrators. The social stratification was beginning, visible in differences in house sizes, grave goods, and access to prestige items like copper tools or imported stone for tools and jewellery. And the pottery, always the pottery, marks the Ubaid as a distinct period in human development. Ubaid ceramic vessels are immediately recognizable. Buff-colored clay painted with geometric patterns in brown or black pigment, sophisticated shapes from simple bowls to elaborate vessels with spouts and handles. The quality is impressive, even by modern standards, showing technical skill in firing temperatures, clay preparation, and decorative application. But what's more impressive is the distribution. Ubaid pottery appears at sites hundreds of miles apart, made with local clay but following shared aesthetic traditions, suggesting either trade networks that moved finished goods across long distances or, more likely, shared cultural identity where potters in different villages were following the same design templates because they saw themselves as part of the same cultural world. The temples from the Ubaid period, like those early levels at Eridu, show architectural sophistication that shouldn't exist this early. They're oriented, often with the entrance facing east or southeast, suggesting attention to solar positions or prevailing winds. They're built on platforms that lifted them above the surrounding village, making them visible landmarks and centers of community identity. They have standardized layouts, with central sanctuaries, offering areas and storage rooms for temple property. This is institutional religion, not shamanism or informal worship. This is organized priestly activity, ritual performed according to established tradition, religious authority exercised over communities that saw the temple as central to their identity and survival. The Ubaid economy was already complex, based on irrigated agriculture, but supplemented by fishing, animal husbandry, and craft production. Textile production, visible in the spindle whorls and loom weights found at Ubaid sites, suggests specialized labor and probably trade in finished cloth. Metallurgy was developing, with copper tools appearing at some sites, evidence of long-distance trade since copper sources were distant from the alluvial plain where Ubaid villages clustered. Stone tools were still dominant, but the presence of imported materials, whether copper from the Zagros, obsidian from Anatolia, or semi-precious stones from distant sources, shows that these villages were connected to broader trade networks that moved goods across regions and probably facilitated the spread of ideas, techniques, and cultural practices. By 3800 BCE, when the Ubaid period transitioned into what archaeologists call the Uruk period, the foundations of Sumerian civilization were firmly established. Villages were growing into towns, towns were growing into cities. writing was just a few centuries away from invention. The organizational complexity, the economic surplus, the social stratification, the religious institutions, all of it was in place, ready to coalesce into the urban explosion that would make Uruk the world's first true city and establish Sumer as the birthplace of civilization. While Egypt was still centuries away from its first dynasty, millennia away from its pyramids, Mesopotamia was already complex, already sophisticated, already ancient. By 3500 BCE, Uruk had become something the world had never seen before. A true city, with perhaps 50,000 inhabitants living within its walls, working in specialized crafts, worshipping at massive temple complexes, recording transactions in the world's first writing. The pyramids wouldn't be built for another 1,000 years. Egyptian hieroglyphs wouldn't be invented for several more centuries. But in Uruk, scribes were already pressing symbols into wet clay, creating the archives that would preserve Sumerian knowledge for 5,000 years. The White Temple at Uruk, a massive structure built on an artificial platform, stood 40 feet high, visible for miles across the flat Mesopotamian plain, a statement of human ambition that predates the step pyramid of Djoser by several centuries. Try to imagine what 50,000 people living in one place meant in the 4th millennium BCE. Most of human history up to that point had been small bands, extended families, villages that might house a few hundred people at most. The organizational complexity required to feed, house, and govern 50,000 individuals without modern technology, without even the concept of urban planning, drawn from previous examples, staggers the mind. Yet Uruk achieved it, and the archaeological evidence shows they did it with sophistication that wouldn't be matched for over a millennium. The German Archaeological Institute, working at Uruk since the early 20th century, has revealed a city that sprawled across nearly 600 hectares at its height, protected by massive walls that later tradition attributed to Gilgamesh himself. The urban plan was complex, residential districts separated by function and probably social class, industrial areas for pottery production and metalworking, set apart from living spaces, administrative centers where the business of running a city was conducted, and at the heart of it all, the temple complexes that dominated the skyline and the spiritual life of the population. This wasn't organic growth. This was planning, deliberate design, conscious decisions about how a city should function. The Eanna district, dedicated to the goddess Inanna, was a complex of temples, courtyards, and administrative buildings that covered several hectares in the center of the city. The buildings were monumental, constructed with techniques that pushed the boundaries of what mud brick architecture could achieve. The limestone temple, so called for its use of imported limestone in an environment where stone was scarce and expensive, featured massive columns, mosaic decorations made from colored clay cones pressed into the walls to create geometric patterns, and evidence of elaborate ritual activity that required specialized priests and enormous quantities of offerings. The resources required to build and maintain these structures suggest an economic system capable of generating surplus on a scale unprecedented in human history. But it's the White Temple, perched on its ziggurat platform at the edge of the city, that captures the imagination and announces Uruk's ambitions to the cosmos. Built around 3200 BCE, this structure rose 40 feet above the surrounding plain on an artificial mountain constructed entirely by human labor. The platform alone represents hundreds of thousands of mud bricks, tons of material moved and shaped and stacked with precision that created a stable foundation for the temple that crowned it. The temple itself was a rectangular building with distinctive architectural features, buttressed walls that created patterns of light and shadow, corners oriented to the cardinal directions with accuracy that suggests astronomical knowledge and careful surveying. This was architecture as statement, as theology made physical, as proof that humanity could build mountains and place their gods at the summit. The economic machinery that supported this urban explosion is visible in the thousands of clay tablets that begin appearing in Uruk's archaeological levels around 3200 BCE. These earliest written documents aren't poetry or religious texts. They're accounts. So many sheep delivered to the temple, so many jars of oil distributed to workers, so many loads of grain stored in warehouses for redistribution. The tablets reveal an economy of staggering complexity, with specialized administrators tracking resources that flowed into and out of temple storehouses, recording transactions between merchants, documenting the redistribution of goods to workers who no longer grew their own food because they were full-time craftsmen, priests, or bureaucrats. The population density meant specialization at levels impossible in smaller settlements. Potters who did nothing but make pottery, achieving quality and quantity that part-time producers could never match. Metalworkers who devoted their lives to mastering techniques for casting copper tools and weapons. Textile workers who turned sheep's wool into cloth fine enough to be traded across continents. Scribes who spent years learning the increasingly complex writing system that evolved from simple pictographs to sophisticated cuneiform, capable of expressing abstract concepts and grammatical nuance. Each specialist depended on the urban economy to feed them, clothe them, house them, freeing them to focus on perfecting their craft in ways that drove technological innovation and cultural development. And all of this, every aspect of Uruk's urban explosion, happened while Egypt was still in its pre-dynastic period, still figuring out basic social organization, still centuries away from its first dynasty and 1,000 years from its first pyramid. Uruk was the proof of concept for urban civilization, the beta test that demonstrated cities were possible, that tens of thousands of people could live together if you had the right social technologies, the right economic systems, the right ideological frameworks to make it all cohere. Every city that came after, including the great cities of Egypt, would learn from Uruk's example, whether through direct cultural contact or by rediscovering the same solutions to the same fundamental problems of urban life. But there was something else in Uruk, something preserved in the king list and in later literary traditions, a sense that the city's magnificence was connected to a deeper past, to knowledge that came from before the flood, from a time when the rules were different and the world was younger and stranger than it would ever be again. The Sumerian king list, compiled in the early 2nd millennium BCE but recording traditions far older, begins with a phrase that still sends chills down archaeological spines. When kingship was lowered from heaven. It lists kings who reigned for impossible spans of time, tens of thousands of years, rulers from before the flood whose names read like mythology: Alulim, Alalga, Enmenluana. Scholars debate what these numbers mean, whether they're symbolic, whether they represent dynasties rather than individuals. But one thing is clear: the Sumerians believed their civilization stretched back into a past so remote it blurred into legend, a time before the flood when the world was different and the rules were not yet set. The king list exists in multiple copies, each slightly different, compiled from older sources that the scribes themselves probably didn't fully understand. The version known as the Weld-Blundell prism, a clay prism now housed in the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, is the most complete, and it reads like history slowly dissolving into myth as you go further back in time. The later kings have reasonable reign lengths measured in years that make sense for human lifespans. But as you move backward through the dynasties, before the flood that the text treats as a historical dividing line, the numbers become absurd. Alulim, the first king of Eridu, reigned for 28,800 years. Alalga, who followed him, managed 36,000 years on the throne. Enmenlu-Ana of Bad Tibira supposedly ruled for 43,200 years. No serious scholar believes these numbers represent literal chronology, but what do they represent? One theory suggests they're not individual reigns, but dynastic periods, with each name standing in for multiple rulers whose specific identities were lost to time but whose period of rule was remembered. Another interpretation reads the numbers as symbolic, encoded in a mathematical or mystical system we no longer understand, perhaps related to astronomical cycles or religious numerology. A third possibility, more unsettling, is that the numbers reflect a different understanding of time itself, a conceptual framework where the deep past wasn't measured in human generations but in cosmic cycles, mythic ages that bore no relation to the solar years that govern our calendars. What's consistent across all the versions of the king list is the flood. It appears as a dividing line, a break in continuity so absolute that it resets the world. Before the flood, the antediluvian kings, with their impossible reign lengths, ruling from cities that may or may not have been historical. After the flood, kingship descended from heaven again, this time to Kish, and the reign lengths dropped to mere thousands of years before eventually settling into historically verifiable numbers that match other records from the 3rd and 2nd millennia BCE. The flood isn't treated as myth in the king list. It's treated as history, as an event that actually happened, that destroyed the old world and required civilization to be rebuilt from scratch. This matters because it shows how the Sumerians understood their own past. They knew they were ancient. Their cities had already been continuously inhabited for thousands of years when the king list was compiled. Their temples stood on foundations that went back into the mists of time. But they also believed that their civilization had been interrupted, that knowledge had been lost in the flood and had to be recovered or reinvented. The antediluvian kings weren't just legendary rulers, they were repositories of wisdom from before the catastrophe. Figures who knew things that later generations could only glimpse through fragmentary memory and carefully preserved tradition. And here's what haunts the archaeological imagination. The king list might be preserving something real. Not the impossible reign lengths, not the specific details of antediluvian kingship, but the memory of cultural disruption, of a catastrophic event that broke the chain of transmission and forced survivors to rebuild from whatever knowledge they could salvage. The flood stories that appear throughout Mesopotamian literature aren't just mythology. They might be the echoes of genuine disaster, remembered and retold and embellished across thousands of years until the historical event became inseparable from the mythological narrative that grew around it. The cities the king list names as prediluvian seats of power, Eridu, Bad Tibira, Larak, Sipar, Shurupak, were all real places, all excavated by archaeologists, all showing occupation layers that stretch back into the Ubaid period and beyond. These weren't invented cities from pure mythology. They were actual settlements whose ruins still rise from the Mesopotamian plain, whose temple platforms still mark the locations where ancient priests performed rituals that were already ancient when the king list was written. The Sumerians weren't making things up. They were preserving traditions about their own deep past. traditions that had been maintained through oral transmission and periodic written compilation for so long that the boundaries between history and legend had become porous, letting myth and memory blend into something stranger than either. Every ancient culture has a flood story, but the Sumerian version is the oldest we've found, preserved on tablets that predate the biblical account by over 1,000 years. The Epic of Atrahasis and the flood story embedded in the Epic of Gilgamesh describe a catastrophic deluge that destroyed the world, sent by gods who regretted creating humanity. Ziusudra, the Sumerian Noah, builds a boat and saves the seed of all living things. But here's what makes it haunting. Geological evidence suggests massive flooding in Mesopotamia around 5000 BCE. Real inundations that would have seemed apocalyptic to early settlers. The Sumerians might be remembering something real, an actual disaster that reset their world and became embedded in cultural memory so deep it shaped their entire worldview. The flood narrative in the Epic of Gilgamesh is particularly detailed, embedded in the 11th tablet where Gilgamesh meets Utnapishtim, the Babylonian version of the Sumerian Ziusudra, who survived the deluge and was granted immortality by the gods. Utnapishtim describes how Ea, the god of wisdom, warned him of the coming flood by speaking to the reed walls of his house, instructing him to build a massive boat and fill it with the seed of all living things, with craftsmen and animals and provisions for a voyage of unknown duration. The boat's dimensions are given precisely: 7 stories high, 1 acre in area, coated with bitumen inside and out to make it watertight. When the flood came, it lasted 7 days and 7 nights, rain falling with such intensity that even the gods were frightened by what they had unleashed. The detail in these accounts suggests they're drawing on genuine tradition, on stories told and retold, refined through countless retellings until every element had meaning, every image carried weight. The boat landing on a mountain after the waters recede, Utnapishtim sending out birds to test whether the land was dry, the sacrifice offered to gods who smelled the sweet savour and clustered around it like flies. Grateful that humanity had survived, all of these narrative elements appear with variations in flood stories across the ancient Near East, suggesting either common origin or common experience, shared memory of catastrophic flooding that affected multiple cultures simultaneously. And the geological evidence supports the possibility of genuine mega-floods in ancient Mesopotamia. Leonard Woolley, excavating at in the 1920s, found a layer of clean water-laid clay 8 feet thick, cutting through the occupation layers like a knife, separating the ubaid pottery below from later material above. He interpreted this as evidence of the flood, the biblical deluge, and though later scholarship has been more cautious, the presence of flood deposits at multiple Mesopotamian sites suggests periodic inundation that would have been devastating to early agricultural settlements dependent on stable water levels and predictable growing seasons. The Tigris and Euphrates weren't gentle rivers. They flooded catastrophically, changing course without warning, destroying villages and fields that had existed for generations. In a world without weather prediction, without the ability to track upstream conditions, without any warning system beyond the observation that the water was rising and rising fast, such floods would have seemed supernatural, divine punishment or cosmic catastrophe that threatened the very existence of the world. If you survived by retreating to high ground, or by somehow staying afloat while your entire village disappeared beneath muddy water, that experience would mark you, would mark your culture, would become the kind of story that gets told for generations, refined and elevated and made mythological, because the literal truth was too terrible to confront without wrapping it in narrative structure. The Sumerians living in the 4th and 3rd millennia BCE would have known about floods, would have experienced them personally or heard detailed accounts from survivors, but they also believed something more, something preserved in their myths about the antediluvian age, that before the Great Flood things had been different. The early kings lived longer, perhaps the gods were more present, perhaps the knowledge was deeper. The flood represented a break, a rupture in continuity that separated the deep past from historical time. Everything after the flood was diminished somehow, a shadow of what came before. Civilization had to be rebuilt, techniques relearned, knowledge recovered from whatever had been saved. Whether this reflects genuine cultural memory of some catastrophic event, or whether it's a mythological explanation for cultural change, we may never know. But the flood narratives shaped Sumerian thought in profound ways, creating a worldview where the present was always in dialogue with a lost past, where the greatest wisdom came from before the catastrophe, where the goal of civilization was to recover and preserve knowledge that might otherwise be lost when the next disaster came. This is why they wrote everything down, pressing their knowledge into clay with such obsessive detail. They had learned, whether from actual experience or mythological teaching, that memory alone wasn't enough, that catastrophe could wipe out entire libraries of oral tradition in a single generation. Only writing could preserve knowledge across the kind of rupture that the flood represented. The earliest writing appears in Uruk around 3200 BCE, simple pictographs pressed into clay to record economic transactions. Hieroglyphic writing in Egypt appears around 3100 BCE, perhaps inspired by the Mesopotamian innovation, perhaps independently invented. But that century matters. That 100-year gap represents the difference between invention and adaptation, between the first fumbling attempts to capture language in visual form and the refinement of an idea that was already proven. The Sumerians weren't just earlier, they were the prototype, the experiment that showed the rest of the world what writing could do. The first written documents from Uruk are so primitive they almost don't qualify as writing in the way we understand it. They're pictographs, simple drawings of objects pressed into clay with a stylus, a jar shape to represent oil, a head shape to represent a person, a triangle to represent a sheep. There's no grammar, no syntax, no way to express anything abstract or complex, just tallies, counts, records of goods moving through temple warehouses, 30 jars of oil delivered, 5 sheep received, 2 units of grain distributed, the kind of information that memory could handle in a small village, but that became impossible once the economy reached urban scale. When thousands of transactions occurred daily, and administrators needed permanent records they could consult months or years later to settle disputes or track trends. But watch what happens over the next few centuries. The pictographs become standardized, each scribe drawing the same symbols in the same way so that records from different scribes could be read consistently. The shapes become more abstract, easier to draw quickly with a reed stylus, evolving from realistic pictures toward the wedge-shaped marks we call cuneiform. Phonetic elements begin appearing, symbols used not for their meaning but for their sound, allowing scribes to write names, foreign words, grammatical elements that couldn't be represented pictographically. By 3000 BCE, just 200 years after those first crude tallies, cuneiform could express anything language could express, could capture poetry, legal arguments, historical narratives, religious hymns, personal letters. Any thought that could be spoken could now be written and preserved. The Egyptian hieroglyphs that appear around 3100 BCE are fully formed from the beginning, capable of representing both sounds and meanings, complete with grammatical markers and sophisticated visual aesthetics. This has always puzzled scholars, because writing systems aren't usually born complete. They evolve, fumbling toward complexity through generations of use and refinement. But hieroglyphs appear without clear antecedents, without the centuries of development visible in Mesopotamian cuneiform. The most likely explanation is that the Egyptians borrowed the concept of writing from Mesopotamia, the idea that marks could preserve language, and then developed their own system suited to their language and their aesthetic preferences. They didn't copy cuneiform directly, but they didn't have to reinvent the entire concept of writing from scratch, because the Mesopotamians had already proven it was possible. That century of priority matters enormously. It means that when the first Egyptian dynasties were forming, when the pharaohs were beginning to establish the administrative apparatus that would eventually build the pyramids, they had the example of Mesopotamian writing to draw on, even if only conceptually. They knew that complex societies needed record keeping, that memory and oral tradition weren't sufficient once populations and economic systems reached certain thresholds of complexity. The Sumerians had paid the developmental cost of inventing writing, had gone through the centuries of experimentation and refinement. Egypt benefited from that innovation, even if they created their own distinct writing system, rather than adopting cuneiform directly. And the uses of writing expanded faster in Egypt than they had in Mesopotamia precisely because the Egyptians knew from the beginning what writing could do. While Sumerian scribes spent centuries using cuneiform primarily for administrative purposes before someone thought to preserve literary works, Egyptian hieroglyphs were used for monumental inscriptions, religious texts, and propaganda almost from the moment of invention. They skipped the purely administrative phase because they understood from Mesopotamian example that writing was a tool of power, of memory, of cultural transmission that transcended its humble origins in warehouse accounting. Still, the priority belongs to Sumer. The first marks pressed into clay with intention to preserve information, the first systematic use of symbols to represent language, the first archives where knowledge could be stored outside human memory. All of it happened in Uruk and spread outward from there, inspiring or directly influencing every writing system that followed. When you read anything, in any language, using any script, you're participating in a tradition that began with Sumerian scribes making marks in wet clay to track how much barley went into the temple storehouse. That's the foundation. Everything else is elaboration. Long before the Egyptians aligned the Great Pyramid to true north, with astonishing precision, Sumerian priests were tracking the movements of Venus, recording its risings and setting in tablets that show mathematical sophistication that shouldn't exist this early. The Venus tablet of Ammisaduqa, copied from much older sources, preserves observations of the planet's movements across 21 years, marking the dates when it appeared and disappeared with precision that suggests centuries of accumulated knowledge. These weren't primitive stargazers making lucky guesses. These were astronomers with mathematical systems, predictive models, and written records that allowed them to build on the observations of previous generations. The Venus tablet is a strange document, compiled during the reign of Ammisaduqa, a king of the first dynasty of Babylon who ruled around the 17th century BCE. But the astronomical observations it records are clearly copied from much older sources, possibly dating back to the late 3rd millennium BCE or even earlier. The tablet records the dates when Venus first became visible in the morning sky before sunrise, and when it disappeared, when it reappeared in the evening sky after sunset, and when it vanished again, tracking the planet's complex cycles with accuracy that requires systematic observation over many years. The level of detail is extraordinary. Specific months, specific days, specific relationships between Venus's appearances and other celestial events. This isn't casual sky watching. This is professional astronomy, institutionalized observation, knowledge accumulated and preserved across generations of priestly astronomers who understood that patterns in the sky repeated and could be predicted if you had sufficient data. The mathematical framework supporting these observations was based on the sexagesimal system, the base 60 mathematics that the Sumerians developed and that we still use for measuring time and angles. This wasn't arbitrary. 60 is divisible by many smaller numbers, making it useful for complex calculations involving fractions and ratios. The Sumerians divided the circle into 360 degrees, each degree into 60 minutes, creating a mathematical framework that could handle the angular measurements necessary for tracking celestial bodies across the sky. They calculated the synodic period of Venus, the time it takes for the planet to return to the same position relative to Earth and the Sun, with accuracy that suggests sophisticated understanding of planetary motion. But why Venus specifically? Why did Sumerian astronomers focus so intensely on this particular planet? Part of the answer lies in the planet's visibility and dramatic behavior. Venus is the brightest object in the sky after the Sun and Moon, appearing as the morning star or evening star depending on its position in its orbit, and its movements are complex, appearing and disappearing according to cycles that must have seemed significant to people watching the skies night after night. But there's something else, something preserved in Sumerian religious tradition. Venus was identified with Inanna, the goddess of love and war, whose mythology emphasized her descent into the underworld and her return. The astronomical observations of Venus's disappearances and reappearances might have been connected to this mythology, or the mythology might have developed from the astronomical observations. Either way, the study of Venus was both scientific and religious, an attempt to understand the movements of a goddess written in the stars. The precision required for these observations is remarkable. You can't just glance at the sky and record when Venus appears. You need to watch systematically, night after night, year after year, noting the exact dates and circumstances of each appearance and disappearance. You need to maintain records that can be compared across years to identify repeating patterns. You need mathematical tools to calculate intervals and predict future events based on past observations. And you need institutional support, priestly positions dedicated to sky watching, resources allocated to maintain observation platforms, systems for training new observers to continue the work when the current generation dies. All of this existed in Sumer by the 3rd millennium BCE, possibly earlier, creating an astronomical tradition that would influence Babylonian science, which in turn would shape Greek astronomy, which became the foundation for European astronomy all the way through the Renaissance. The Egyptians were also skilled astronomers. They aligned the Great Pyramid to true north with an accuracy of about 3/60ths of a degree, an achievement that required careful observation of circumpolar stars and sophisticated understanding of geometry. But the Egyptian astronomical observations that survive tend to be focused on practical applications, tracking the annual flood of the Nile, creating calendars for agricultural purposes, aligning monuments for religious reasons. The Sumerian astronomical tradition went deeper, attempting to understand celestial mechanics, to predict future positions of planets, to create mathematical models of cosmic motion. They were doing theoretical astronomy, not just applied observation, and they wrote it all down, preserving their observations in cuneiform tablets that would survive the fall of their civilization, the conquest of their cities, the extinction of their language. The astronomical knowledge pressed into those tablets would be inherited by the Babylonians, refined and elaborated, eventually transmitted to the Greeks, who transformed it into the mathematical astronomy that dominated Western science for 2 millennia. Every astronomical calculation, every planetary prediction, every attempt to model the movements of celestial bodies traces its lineage back to those Sumerian priests watching Venus rise and set, recording each appearance with patience that spanned lifetimes, building knowledge that would outlast empires. The temples at Eridu weren't random constructions. Even in the earliest layers, archaeologists found evidence of precise orientation, of mathematical ratios in the building proportions, of sacred geometry that suggests sophisticated understanding of architectural principles. The later ziggurats, massive stepped pyramids that dominated the Mesopotamian skyline, developed from these early temple platforms, each generation building higher, reaching toward heaven with ambition that rivals anything Egypt would achieve. The ziggurat at Ur, excavated by Leonard Woolley in the 1920s, dates to the 21st century BCE, contemporary with Egypt's Middle Kingdom, but it represents the culmination of a building tradition that was already 2,000 years old. Stand at the base of a ziggurat if you could, in its prime when the mud brick was still fresh and the facades were decorated with elaborate patterns. The structure rises in massive steps, each level smaller than the one below, creating a mountain that exists nowhere in nature on the flat Mesopotamian plain. The proportions aren't accidental. Woolley's careful measurements of the ziggurat at Ur revealed mathematical relationships in the dimensions, ratios that appear again and again in Mesopotamian sacred architecture. The relationship between base width and height, the proportions of each successive level, the placement of staircases that ascended the face of the structure toward the temple that crowned the summit. This was architecture as mathematics, as sacred proportion, as physical manifestation of cosmic order. The core of these ziggurats was solid mud brick, millions upon millions of individual bricks made from Mesopotamian clay mixed with chopped straw, dried in the sun or baked in kilns, then stacked by hand into structures that could rise 70 feet or more above the plain. The engineering required to make such structures stable was formidable. Mud brick is strong in compression but vulnerable to water damage, and the Mesopotamian climate featured both intense heat and occasional torrential rain. The builders compensated with sophisticated drainage systems built into the ziggurat structure, with bitumen waterproofing on exterior surfaces, with carefully calculated buttresses and setbacks that distributed weight and prevented collapse. They were solving engineering problems that wouldn't be encountered anywhere else for centuries. But it's the orientation that reveals the deeper purpose. Like the temples at Eridu before them, the ziggurats were aligned, their corners pointing to the cardinal directions with precision that required astronomical knowledge and careful surveying. The staircases typically faced east or southeast, toward the rising sun, or toward specific stellar risings that had religious significance. The summit temples, where the god was believed to descend from heaven to meet with priests, were positioned to capture first light or to align with significant celestial events. This wasn't just architecture, it was cosmology made physical, an attempt to create on Earth a structure that reflected the order of the heavens. Compare this to Egyptian temple architecture, which also featured astronomical alignment and sacred proportions. The temple at Karnak, begun in the Middle Kingdom and elaborated over centuries, shows sophisticated understanding of geometry and celestial relationships. But the Middle Kingdom itself began around 2100 BCE, contemporary with Ur's ziggurat. The Egyptian temples were building on architectural traditions that were still being developed, while Mesopotamian sacred architecture was already ancient, already refined through millennia of experimentation and rebuilding. The Egyptian temples are magnificent, but they're answering questions that Sumerian architects had been exploring for 2,000 years. The ziggurats served a different function than Egyptian pyramids, and the difference is theologically significant. A pyramid sealed the pharaoh's body inside, creating an eternal house for the king who had become a god, a machine for transformation and preservation. A ziggurat was open, accessible, a platform that elevated the temple toward heaven so that the god could more easily descend to earth. The pyramid was about death and immortality. The ziggurat was about the meeting of human and divine, about creating a space where heaven and earth overlapped. Both are profound architectural statements, but they emerged from fundamentally different religious worldviews, and the ziggurat tradition was already established, already perfected, when Egypt was just beginning to imagine pyramid building. The construction techniques developed for ziggurat building influenced architecture across the ancient Near East. The use of mud brick as monumental building material, the mathematical proportioning of structures, the integration of drainage and waterproofing systems, all of these innovations spread from Mesopotamia into surrounding regions. When you see stepped pyramids or temple platforms anywhere in the ancient world, you're looking at echoes of Sumerian ziggurat tradition, architectural ideas that proved so powerful and so useful that they were adopted, adapted, and reimagined by culture after culture across millennia. And always, beneath the ziggurats, there were earlier temples, simpler structures marking the same sacred spots, maintaining continuity across thousands of years of building and rebuilding. The ziggurat wasn't an innovation. It was an elaboration, the perfection of an architectural idea that stretched back through the Ubaid temples, back through the earliest mud brick platforms, all the way back to those simple reed structures that marked Eridu as sacred in the 6th millennium BCE. 5,000 years of continuous building tradition, each generation adding to what came before, creating monuments that announced to the heavens that humanity remembered, that we honored the sacred, that we would build mountains if we had to in order to reach the gods. When archaeologists examine Sumerian artifacts from the Ubaid period, they find evidence of metallurgical knowledge that shouldn't exist this early. Bronze working, copper smelting, gold working with techniques that suggest centuries of experimentation and refinement. The royal cemetery at Ur, dated to around 2600 BCE, yielded golden helmets, lapis lazuli jewellery, musical instruments with complex inlay work, all demonstrating craft traditions that must have been developing for millennia. Egypt would master similar techniques, but later, always later, following paths that Mesopotamia had already explored. The royal cemetery at Ur is one of those archaeological discoveries that changes everything, that forces recalibration of what we thought we knew about ancient capability and ancient sophistication. Woolley, excavating in the late 1920s, found 16 royal tombs filled with treasures that defied contemporary understanding of early dynastic Mesopotamia. Gold worked with techniques so advanced that modern goldsmiths study the artifacts to understand how they were made. Lapis lazuli imported from Afghanistan, carnelian from India, silver from Anatolia, all of it worked into jewellery of extraordinary beauty and technical accomplishment. Musical instruments, including the famous bull-headed lyre with its intricate inlay work of lapis, shell and red limestone, showing craftsmanship that required years of training and mastery of multiple techniques. But it's not just the artistry, it's what the artistry reveals about the depth of technological tradition. You don't create a golden helmet hammered from a single sheet of gold, fitted to follow the contours of a human head with perfect proportions and decorative elements that include individually worked curls of hair, unless you're building on centuries of metalworking experience. The gold work in the royal cemetery represents the peak of a craft tradition that had been developing since the Ubaid period at minimum, probably longer. The techniques for smelting copper, for creating alloys of copper and tin to make bronze, for working gold into sheet form and then shaping it without cracking or tearing, all of this requires accumulated knowledge passed down through generations of master craftsmen training apprentices. The lapis lazuli tells its own story about trade networks and cultural connections spanning thousands of miles. The only known ancient source for lapis was in the mountains of what's now Afghanistan, 2,500 miles from Ur. Getting lapis lazuli from mine to workshop required organized trade, trusted merchants, possibly diplomatic relationships between distant kingdoms, and a level of economic sophistication that let Sumerian cities afford luxury materials from the ends of the known world. The presence of lapis in graves from 2600 BCE means these trade networks were already well established, already functioning reliably enough that luxury goods could flow across continents. Egypt would develop similar long-distance trade, bringing incense from Punt and timber from Lebanon, but later, building networks that the Mesopotamians had been maintaining for centuries. The musical instruments are perhaps the most haunting artifacts from the royal cemetery, not just for their beauty but for what they represent. The bull-headed lyre, its wooden frame decayed but its decorative elements preserved, shows inlay work of incredible precision, tiny pieces of lapis, shell and limestone cut to exact shapes and fitted together to create narrative scenes in the decorative panels. Making such an instrument required not only the craft knowledge to work multiple materials, but also the musical knowledge to create an instrument with proper acoustic properties, proper string tension, proper resonance. This was a musical tradition sophisticated enough to support specialized instrument makers, which means a musical culture that valued performance, that had professional musicians, that understood music as both art and sacred practice. And all of this is from 2600 BCE, contemporary with Egypt's fourth dynasty, the pyramid builders. Egypt was creating its own wonders at this moment, achieving things that still stagger the modern imagination. But the technological sophistication visible in the royal cemetery of Ur represents the culmination of craft traditions that were already ancient. The metalworking, the stonework, the understanding of materials and techniques, all of it had been developing in Mesopotamia for thousands of years before these particular objects were placed in royal graves to accompany the dead into whatever afterlife the Sumerians imagined. Consider what this means for the larger timeline. If the artifacts from 2600 BCE represent mature craft traditions, those traditions must extend back into the 4th millennium BCE at minimum, probably into the Ubaid period of the 5th millennium. That's 2,000 years or more of continuous development in metallurgy, in jewelry making, in musical instrument construction. Egypt was mastering similar technologies during its pre-dynastic and early dynastic periods, but they were starting from further back, developing their craft traditions while Mesopotamia was already producing masterworks. The golden helmets and bull-headed lyres from weren't innovations. They were the perfection of traditions that stretched back into deep time, maintained and refined across centuries by craftsmen whose names are lost, but whose skill speaks across 5 millennia. Walk through the excavated streets of and you're walking through an urban landscape designed 3,000 years before Christ, with drainage systems, standardized building techniques, residential neighborhoods separated from temple precincts. The level of planning suggests centralized authority, bureaucratic organization, and civic identity that Egypt wouldn't develop until the Old Kingdom, when Sumerian cities were already ancient. The Mesopotamians invented the city quite literally, and every urban center that followed, including the great cities of Egypt, learned from their example. The excavated residential quarters at reveal urban planning principles that seem remarkably modern. Houses built according to standardized plans, variations on a central courtyard design that provided light and air to interior rooms while maintaining privacy from the street. The courtyard plan makes sense in the Mesopotamian climate, creating shaded exterior space where families could work and socialize while avoiding the brutal midday heat. But the standardization suggests building codes, shared understanding of what a proper house should look like, possibly even centralized planning authority that regulated construction to maintain neighborhood coherence and urban functionality. The streets themselves were narrow, winding between house blocks in patterns that seem chaotic to modern eyes, accustomed to grid planning. But the chaos was functional. The narrow streets created shade, reduced wind-blown sand, made the city walkable even in summer heat. The houses had drainage systems built into their foundations, with terracotta pipes that carried wastewater from interior courtyards to larger drains running beneath the streets, eventually emptying outside the city walls. This required engineering at the city-wide scale, coordination between individual builders and civic authorities, maintenance systems to keep drains functioning across decades of use. This was urban infrastructure, the kind of planning that makes high-density living possible without creating public health catastrophes. The separation of residential, religious, and administrative districts shows intentional urban design. The temple complexes occupied the city's sacred center, elevated on platforms that made them visible landmarks and clearly designated sacred space. The administrative buildings, where the bureaucratic machinery of city governance operated, clustered near the temples, reflecting the integration of religious and political authority in Sumerian society. The residential quarters spread outward from this central core, with different neighborhoods possibly housing different social classes or occupational groups, creating an urban geography where your address indicated your place in the social hierarchy. Compare this to early Egyptian urbanism, and the difference in timing becomes clear. The Egyptian Old Kingdom did develop sophisticated cities, particularly the workers' villages that housed the pyramid builders and the administrative centers that governed the emerging state. But this urban development occurred during the 26th through 23rd centuries BCE, when had already been a functioning city for over 1,000 years. The Egyptians weren't stupid or slow. They were solving the same problems of urban organization that the Mesopotamians had confronted, but they were solving them later, in a different environmental context with different resources and different social structures. The city itself was a Mesopotamian invention in the same way that writing was a Mesopotamian invention. Not that permanent settlements didn't exist elsewhere, but the specific package of features that defines urban civilization appeared first in Sumer: high population density, occupational specialization, centralized administration, monumental architecture, written records, social stratification, all of it emerging together in the late 4th millennium BCE in Uruk, and spreading from there to other Mesopotamian settlements. When Egypt developed cities during the Old Kingdom, when the Indus Valley Civilization built Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro, when Bronze Age Greece constructed palatial complexes, they were all working with urban templates that Mesopotamia had pioneered, even if each culture adapted the basic urban model to their own specific circumstances. The standardized building techniques visible in Ur's residential architecture represent accumulated knowledge about what works in mud brick construction. The proper ratio of clay to straw to make durable bricks, the thickness of walls needed to support upper stories, the placement of doorways to maximize structural stability, the integration of wooden beams to bind brick walls together and prevent cracking. All of this was learned through trial and error, through generations of builders experimenting and refining techniques until they discovered methods that worked reliably across varied applications. By the time Egyptian architects were beginning to work with mud brick in the pre-dynastic period, Mesopotamian builders had already been perfecting these techniques for millennia, and the cities themselves became models for human organization, proof that large populations could live together productively if you had the right social technologies, laws to regulate behavior and resolve disputes, administrative systems to distribute resources and coordinate labor, religious institutions to maintain social cohesion and provide shared identity, economic systems that allowed specialization and trade. All of it developed first in Mesopotamian cities, tested and refined there before spreading outward to influence every urban civilization that followed. The Sumerians gave us the 60-minute hour, the 60-second minute, the 360-degree circle. Their base 60 mathematical system, developed for astronomical calculations and temple accounting, was so useful that it survived the fall of their civilization and persists to this day every time you check your watch. Egyptian mathematics, sophisticated in its own right, used different systems, different approaches, but the Sumerian mathematical tradition influenced the development of Babylonian astronomy, which in turn shaped Greek science, which became the foundation of Western mathematics. The pyramids were built with Egyptian mathematics, but the numbers that measure time itself came from Sumer. The sexagesimal system seems strange to modern minds accustomed to base 10 mathematics, but it has advantages that made it indispensable for ancient calculations. 60 divides evenly by 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10, 12, 15, 20, and 30, making fractional calculations easier than they would be in base 10. If you're dividing things into thirds or quarters or fifths, working in base 60 gives you whole numbers where base 10 gives you repeating decimals. For temple accountants distributing grain to workers, for astronomers calculating planetary positions, for merchants dividing profits among partners, the sexagesimal system was simply more practical than any alternative. The division of the hour into 60 minutes and the minute into 60 seconds comes directly from Sumerian timekeeping, though the Sumerians themselves didn't have mechanical clocks and weren't measuring time with the precision we do now. They divided the day and night each into 12 hours, creating the 24-hour day, and they understood each hour as composed of smaller units based on their sexagesimal mathematics. When Islamic astronomers in the medieval period developed precision instruments for measuring time, they adopted the Babylonian mathematical tradition, which preserved Sumerian sexagesimal calculations, and those standards became the foundation for European timekeeping when Islamic science was translated into Latin during the Renaissance. The 360-degree circle similarly derives from Sumerian mathematics, though the connection to astronomy is more direct. The Sumerians observed that the sun moved through the zodiac, through the band of constellations that mark the ecliptic, completing one circuit in approximately 360 days. Dividing the circle of the ecliptic into 360 degrees, one for each day of the idealized year, created a mathematical framework that was useful for astronomical calculations and sacred geometry. Later, Babylonian astronomers refined this into the sophisticated mathematical astronomy that influenced Greek, Islamic, and eventually European science. But the foundation was Sumerian, developed in the 3rd millennium BCE or earlier. The mathematical tablets that survive from Mesopotamia show calculations of extraordinary sophistication. Multiplication tables, division tables, tables of squares and square roots, reciprocals calculated to many places, all preserved in cuneiform on clay tablets that were used for training scribes in mathematical methods. The level of mathematical knowledge visible in these tablets suggests professional mathematicians, specialists who devoted their lives to calculation and who trained the next generation in methods that had been refined over centuries. This wasn't folk mathematics or practical arithmetic learned by necessity. This was theoretical mathematics, developed and maintained by educated elites who understood that mathematics was foundational to astronomy, architecture, commerce, and governance. Egyptian mathematics, preserved primarily in papyrus documents like the Rin Mathematical Papyrus and the Moscow Mathematical Papyrus, shows a different approach to calculation, using unit fractions rather than the Mesopotamian sexagesimal system. Egyptian mathematics was sophisticated, capable of handling the calculations necessary for pyramid construction, land surveying after Nile floods, and architectural projects of enormous complexity. But it developed later, and it developed independently, creating different solutions to similar problems rather than adopting Mesopotamian methods directly. The two mathematical traditions coexisted, each powerful in its own sphere, but the Sumerian tradition had temporal priority and, through its Babylonian descendants, had more influence on the development of Greek mathematics. Every time you check the time on your phone, seeing the minutes count towards 60 before clicking over to the next hour, you're using Sumerian mathematics. Every time you navigate using compass bearings measured in degrees, every time you calculate an angle or measure an arc, you're working within a mathematical framework that ancient Sumerian astronomers developed for tracking planets across the night sky. The mathematics that measures modern life, that structures our understanding of time and space and angular measurement, that's Sumerian. Preserved across 5,000 years because the system was so useful, so practical, so elegantly suited to human needs that no one ever bothered to replace it. The Fertile Crescent earned its name for a reason. Between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, humans first domesticated wheat and barley, first learned to redirect water through irrigation canals, first transformed from hunter-gatherers into farmers who could support cities. This happened around 10,000 BCE, thousands of years before Egyptian agriculture began. The agricultural surplus that made Sumerian cities possible came from innovations in farming that predated any comparable development in the Nile Valley. Egypt would perfect flood irrigation, would learn to harness the Nile's annual inundation, but Mesopotamia had already been farming for millennia when Egypt was just beginning to plant seeds. The domestication of wheat and barley represents one of the most significant transitions in human history. The moment when people stopped following wild food sources and started cultivating them deliberately, selecting seeds from the best plants, saving them for next year's planting, gradually transforming wild grasses into the productive crops that could support permanent settlements. Archaeological evidence from sites in the northern Fertile Crescent, in the foothills of the Zagros Mountains and the Taurus Range, shows this process beginning around 10,000 BCE, possibly earlier. Wild einkorn, wheat and barley being gathered intensively, then gradually domesticated through selective breeding that enhanced desirable traits, larger seeds, non-shattering seed heads that stayed on the stalk until harvest, more reliable germination. The transition wasn't quick or simple. It took thousands of years of experimentation, of learning which plants grew best in which soils, of understanding seasonal cycles and water requirements, of developing tools for planting, harvesting, and processing grain. But by 6000 BCE, when agriculture reached the southern Mesopotamian plain and the Ubaid period began, the crops were already domesticated, the techniques already proven. The settlers who established Eridu and the other early Ubaid sites weren't inventing agriculture. They were applying knowledge accumulated over millennia in other regions, adapting it to the specific challenges of farming in an environment with less rainfall and more extreme temperatures than the northern hills where agriculture began. And it was in southern Mesopotamia that irrigation agriculture was perfected, that humans learned to redirect river water through canals to fields that otherwise would have been too dry for reliable crops. The Tigris and Euphrates flooded unpredictably, not with the reliable annual cycle of the Nile, but with catastrophic surges that could destroy settlements or fail entirely in drought years. The Sumerians learned to tame these rivers, digging canals that captured floodwater and distributed it according to human need rather than natural caprice, creating weirs and levees that controlled flow, maintaining complex irrigation networks that required coordinated labor and centralized authority. The agricultural surplus made everything else possible. Cities can't exist without farmers producing more food than they personally need, creating surplus that can feed specialists who don't farm, craftsmen, priests, merchants, administrators, soldiers, artists. The more efficient the agriculture, the larger the surplus, the more people can be supported in non-agricultural occupations, the more complex the society can become. Mesopotamian agriculture, based on irrigated wheat and barley supplemented by date palms, vegetables and animal husbandry, was efficient enough to support urban populations in the tens of thousands by the 4th millennium BCE. This wasn't subsistence farming. This was agricultural production at a scale that enabled civilization. Egypt did develop magnificent agriculture, perfectly adapted to the Nile's annual flood cycle. The inundation deposited rich silt, natural fertilizer, that made Egyptian fields incredibly productive without the labor-intensive irrigation systems Mesopotamia required. Egyptian farmers learned to time their planting to the flood, to build basins that captured water and extended the growing season, to maximize yields from land that was naturally generous. But this development occurred later, during the pre-dynastic period, after 5000 BCE. By that time, Mesopotamian farmers had been practicing irrigation agriculture for over 1,000 years, had already learned the techniques that Egypt would have to discover independently or adapt from Mesopotamian models carried by trade and cultural exchange. The crops themselves tell the story. Wheat and barley, domesticated in the northern Fertile Crescent, appear in Egypt during the pre-dynastic period, probably introduced from Mesopotamia through the Levant. The agricultural package that enabled Egyptian civilization wasn't native to the Nile Valley. It was borrowed, adapted from innovations that occurred first in Southwest Asia, in the arc of land stretching from the Persian Gulf through Mesopotamia into the Levantine coast. Egypt's agricultural genius lay in adaptation, in taking crops and techniques developed elsewhere and perfecting them for the unique conditions of the Nile flood cycle. But the foundation, the original domestication of the grains that would feed civilization, that happened in Mesopotamia's sphere, in the Fertile Crescent where agriculture began. And so the timeline extends even further back, before cities, before writing, before temples, to the moment when humans first planted seeds deliberately and waited to see what would grow. That moment, that decision to stay in one place and tend crops rather than move with wild resources, happened in the Fertile Crescent around 10,000 BCE. Everything that followed, all of civilization with its cities and monuments and literature and art, depended on that agricultural foundation. The Sumerians built cities on agricultural surplus that had been thousands of years in development, on techniques refined through countless generations of farmers, learning what worked and what didn't. By the time Egypt was beginning its own agricultural revolution, Mesopotamia had already been farming for 5 millennia, had already learned how to make the land produce enough to support not just villages but cities, not just subsistence but civilization itself. In the royal graves at Ur, Woolley found lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, carnelian from India, timber from Lebanon, obsidian from Anatolia. These weren't random finds. They were evidence of trade networks spanning thousands of miles, organized commerce that connected disparate regions into an economic web centered on Sumerian cities. This was happening in the 3rd millennium BCE, when Egypt was just beginning to establish its own trade relationships. The Sumerians were already experienced merchants, already sophisticated traders, already connected to the wider world in ways that suggest centuries of commercial development. Think about what it takes to move lapis lazuli from the mountains of Afghanistan to the workshops of Ur. The distance alone is staggering, 2,500 miles across varied terrain, through mountains and deserts, across rivers and through territories controlled by different peoples, with different languages and different interests. This wasn't casual exchange between neighboring villages. This was organized long-distance trade requiring infrastructure, trusted intermediaries, standardized systems of measurement and value, probably written contracts, though most of those have been lost to time. The lapis had to be mined in Afghanistan, carried by pack animals or porters to trading centers, exchanged multiple times as it passed through intermediate markets, transported across Persia into Mesopotamia, and finally delivered to Ur, where craftsmen could work it into the jewelry and inlay pieces that ended up in royal graves. The carnelian from India tells a similar story, possibly arriving by sea routes through the Persian Gulf, evidence of maritime trade that connected Mesopotamian cities to the Indus Valley civilization. Ships built of timber imported from Lebanon because the Mesopotamian plain had no trees suitable for shipbuilding, sailing the Gulf waters with cargoes of Mesopotamian wool and grain to trade for Indian gems and spices, returning with goods that would be distributed through Sumerian markets to customers who could afford luxury items from the edges of the known world. This required navigational knowledge, understanding of seasonal winds and currents, ports with facilities for loading and unloading cargo, commercial networks that could absorb and redistribute goods arriving from distant sources. The obsidian from Anatolia was less exotic but still significant. Volcanic glass prized for its sharp edges and lustrous appearance, useful for tools and decorative objects. Anatolia was closer than Afghanistan or India, but still hundreds of miles distant, requiring overland trade routes that had to be maintained, protected, kept open despite political instability and the constant threat of disruption by warfare or banditry. The presence of Anatolian obsidian in Mesopotamian sites from the Ubaid period onward shows these trade routes were ancient, established well before cities existed, maintained and elaborated as Sumerian civilization developed and demand for exotic materials increased. And it wasn't just luxury goods moving through these networks. Copper and tin, the metals needed to make bronze, came from distant sources and had to be imported in quantity to supply Mesopotamian metalworkers. Timber for construction, virtually non-existent on the alluvial plain, came from the mountains of Lebanon and the Zagros Range. Even stone for sculpture and building projects had to be imported since Mesopotamia lacked native stone sources. The very materials that built Sumerian civilization were sourced through trade networks that connected the entire ancient Near East into an economic system centered on Mesopotamian cities. Compare this to Egyptian trade in the same period. Egypt did develop long-distance trade relationships, bringing cedar from Lebanon for shipbuilding and construction, bringing incense and exotic goods from Punt, trading with Nubia for gold and luxury items. But these trade networks developed during and after the Old Kingdom, from the mid-3rd millennium BCE onward. By that time, Mesopotamian traders had been maintaining long-distance commercial relationships for over 1,000 years, had established the practices and institutions that made large-scale trade possible, standardized weights and measures, written contracts, commercial law governing transactions, professional merchant classes whose entire occupation was facilitating exchange between distant regions. The cuneiform tablets preserve evidence of this commercial sophistication. Contracts specifying the term of trade partnerships, one merchant supplying capital for a trading voyage with another merchant doing the actual travelling and trading, profits to be divided according to agreed ratios, letters between merchants discussing market conditions, complaining about the quality of goods received, negotiating prices and delivery terms, legal documents resolving disputes over failed transactions, establishing precedents for commercial law that would influence legal systems for millennia. This wasn't primitive barter. This was commercial capitalism in embryonic form, developed in Sumerian cities during the 3rd millennium BCE and refined through practice until trade became one of the foundations of Mesopotamian prosperity. The wealth visible in Ur's royal graves, the gold and lapis and carnelian worked into objects of extraordinary beauty, represents the concentration of resources made possible by trade. The kings and queens buried with such magnificence weren't just politically powerful, they controlled economic networks that brought the world's treasures to Mesopotamia, that transformed Sumerian cities into cosmopolitan centers connected to distant lands through commerce. When Egypt developed similar wealth and similar international connections during the New Kingdom, they were following patterns that Mesopotamia had established, building trade relationships that the Sumerians had pioneered centuries earlier when the world was younger and the roots were still being discovered. The Code of Hammurabi gets all the attention, but it wasn't the first written law code. That honor goes to the Code of Ur-Nammu, dated to around 2100 BCE, and even that was building on legal traditions that stretch back centuries into Sumerian history. These weren't primitive tribal customs preserved in writing. These were sophisticated legal systems dealing with property rights, commercial contracts, family law, and criminal justice. Egypt had laws, certainly, that they remained largely unwritten through most of the Old Kingdom, preserved in custom and oral tradition, while the Sumerians were already building a legal framework recorded in permanent script. The Code of Ur-Nammu survives only in fragmentary form, copied onto tablets from the original stele that proclaim the laws of Ur-Nammu, founder of the third dynasty of Yer. But even in fragments, the sophistication is clear. The prologue establishes Ur-Nammu's legitimacy, describing how the gods chose him to restore justice and protect the weak from the powerful. Then come the laws themselves, specific cases with specific penalties, creating a legal framework that could be applied consistent across different situations. If a man's wife is accused of adultery but unproven, she shall undergo trial by ordeal. If a man divorces his wife without cause, he shall pay her a specific amount of silver. If a man destroys another man's tree, he shall pay compensation in silver according to the value of the tree. The specificity matters because it shows legal thinking, moving beyond customary justice administered by elders or kings, on a case-by-case basis towards systematic law that could be consulted, cited, applied by judges who might never have met the lawgiver. This is the beginning of legal codes as we understand them, written law that transcends the individuals who created it, that becomes a permanent framework for resolving disputes and maintaining social order. The penalties in Ur-Nammu's code favor monetary compensation over physical punishment, a more sophisticated approach than the eye-for-an-eye retribution that would appear in later Mesopotamian codes, including Hammurabi's more famous version. But Ur-Nammu's code wasn't the beginning. It refers to earlier legal traditions, mentions reforms that corrected abuses in previous systems, suggests a legal culture that had been developing for centuries before anyone thought to inscribe laws on stone stele for public display. Earlier, Sumerian kings left inscriptions describing their legal reforms, their attempts to establish justice and correct corruption, evidence of ongoing legal development that produced increasingly sophisticated systems for regulating social behavior and economic transactions. The tradition that culminated in Ur-Nammu's code stretched back through the early dynastic period into the Uruk period, perhaps even into the Ubaid, developing alongside the other institutions that made urban civilization possible. Compare this to Egyptian law in the same period. Egypt certainly had law, had systems for maintaining order and resolving disputes, had pharaonic authority that could punish crimes and settle conflicts. But Egyptian law remained largely unwritten until much later, preserved in oral tradition and administrative practice rather than codified texts. The wisdom literature that survives from the Old Kingdom discusses proper behavior and social order, but it doesn't provide systematic legal codes. The administrative papyri show the machinery of justice functioning, but they don't preserve the underlying legal principles in the way Mesopotamian law codes do. Egyptian legal codification would come, but later, influenced at least conceptually by the Mesopotamian tradition of written law that had been developing for over 1,000 years by the time Egypt began systematically recording its legal principles. The impact of written law on social development is difficult to overstate. It creates predictability, allowing people to know in advance what consequences will follow from their actions. It limits arbitrary authority, even of kings, because the law stands independent of individual rulers. It allows for legal precedent and legal reasoning, the development of jurisprudence as a specialized field requiring training and expertise. All of this emerged first in Mesopotamia, where the combination of writing and urban complexity created conditions favorable for legal codification. By the time Hammurabi issued his famous code around 1750 BCE, he was working within a legal tradition that was already ancient, refining and systematizing laws that had been developing for over 1,000 years. The stele on which these laws were inscribed weren't just practical documents. They were political statements, monuments declaring that the king had established justice, that he ruled according to divine mandate, that the social order he maintained reflected cosmic order established by the gods. The laws were often displayed in public places, temple courtyards where people could see them even if most couldn't read them. Symbolic assertions that justice was written, permanent, accessible to all rather than the private knowledge of ruling elites. This was law as civic religion, as foundational mythology, as the story a society tells itself about how it maintains order and protects the vulnerable from exploitation. The Sumerian pantheon wasn't a simple collection of nature gods. It was a divine bureaucracy, a heavenly organization that mirrored the earthly complexity of Sumerian city-states, with gods assigned specific duties, specific cities, specific areas of cosmic responsibility. Anu, Enlil, Enki, Inanna, each with elaborate mythologies, each with temples, each with priesthoods that preserved and elaborated their stories across millennia. Egyptian religion would develop similar complexity, but later, building toward the elaborate theology of the New Kingdom from simpler foundations. The Sumerians started complex, as if the religious system was already ancient when it was first written down. Anu was the sky god, father of the gods, dwelling in the highest heaven where he presided over the divine assembly but rarely intervened directly in earthly affairs. His temple was at Uruk, shared with Inanna, his granddaughter, a pairing that reflected both cosmic hierarchy and civic pride, since Uruk claimed special status as the city where heaven and earth most closely touched. Enlil was the air god, the storm, the wind, the power that separated heaven from earth and made space for creation. His temple was at Nippur, which functioned as a religious capital even when political power shifted to other cities, and he was the god who granted kingship, whose blessing legitimized rulers, and whose curse could destroy dynasties. Enki was the water god, lord of the underground ocean of fresh water called the Abzu, god of wisdom and magic and crafts, the divine patron of human civilization, who taught humanity the arts that made urban life possible. His temple was at Eridu, the first city, the most ancient of sacred sites. Inanna was the most complex, goddess of love and war, of sexuality and violence, of the morning and evening star, Venus whose movements Sumerian astronomers tracked with such intensity. Her mythology included descent into the underworld and return, death and resurrection, themes that would echo through later religious traditions but that in Sumerian thought represented the cycles of nature, the disappearance and reappearance of Venus, the seasonal death and rebirth of vegetation. Her temple at Uruk was one of the greatest architectural complexes in Mesopotamia, rebuilt and elaborated across millennia, the center of a cult that attracted pilgrims from across the Sumerian world. But these weren't the only gods. The pantheon included hundreds of deities, each with specific roles, specific genealogies, specific relationships to other gods and to human cities. There were gods of grain and beer, of the plough and the brick mould, of writing and of accounting, divine patrons for every craft and every aspect of civilization. The level of detail preserved in Sumerian religious texts suggests centuries of theological development, of priests elaborating divine mythologies, of scribes recording and systematizing religious knowledge, until the pantheon became a vast interconnected network of divine beings whose relationships and responsibilities mirrored the complexity of Sumerian society itself. This theological complexity served practical purposes. Each city had a patron deity whose temple was the city's religious and often economic center. The temple owned land, employed workers, collected offerings, redistributed resources, functioned as both church and bank and social welfare system. The priests who served the temple were specialists, trained in the elaborate rituals required to maintain divine favor, educated in the mythologies that explained cosmic order and human responsibility. The religious system was integrated into every aspect of Sumerian life, providing ideological justification for social hierarchies, economic organization, political authority. The king ruled by divine mandate, chosen by the gods to maintain order and justice on their behalf. The laws were divine commands, violations punishable not just by human authorities, but by cosmic forces that would punish impiety and reward righteousness. Egyptian religion developed similar complexity, eventually producing elaborate theologies that explained creation, divine kingship, the afterlife, and cosmic order. But Egyptian religion in the Old Kingdom, when the pyramids were being built, was simpler, more focused on the pharaoh as divine intermediary, less bureaucratically organized than the Sumerian system with its divine assembly and specialized temple hierarchies. The complexity would come, elaborated during the Middle and New Kingdoms until Egyptian religion rivaled Mesopotamian theology for sophistication and detail. But the Sumerian system was already complex in the 3rd millennium BCE, already preserving mythologies that seemed ancient even to the scribes who recorded them, already functioning as an integrated system of cosmic explanation and social organization that has been refined across centuries of priestly scholarship. Small innovations change the world. The potter's wheel, invented in Mesopotamia around 3500 BCE, revolutionized ceramic production, allowing for standardized vessels, mass production of containers for grain and oil, the creation of a material culture that could support urban populations. Egypt wouldn't adopt the potter's wheel until around 2800 BCE, 500 years later. Those 5 centuries of Mesopotamian pottery production represent hundreds of millions of vessels, an entire economic infrastructure built on a Sumerian innovation that Egypt would eventually borrow. Before the wheel, all pottery was hand-built, coiled or molded, shaped by patient pressure and careful technique that limited both production speed and vessel uniformity. A skilled potter could make beautiful pots this way, could create complex forms and elaborate decorations, but quantity was always limited by the time required to build each vessel individually. The potter's wheel changed everything. A lump of clay centered on a spinning disc could be pulled upward into a vessel form in minutes, the rotational momentum doing work that human hands alone could never match. With practice, a potter could produce dozens of vessels in a day, all similar in size and shape, standardized containers that could be used interchangeably for storage and transport. The earliest potter's wheels were simple tournettes, slow-turning platforms that assisted hand-building but didn't replace it. But by 3500 BCE, Mesopotamian potters were using true fast wheels, momentum wheels that could be kicked or spun to maintain rotational speed while the potter shaped the vessel. The fast wheel required new techniques, new ways of centering clay and controlling form, but it enabled production at scales impossible with hand-building. The standardized vessels that result from wheel production appear in Mesopotamian sites throughout the Uruk period, evidence of mass production that supported urban populations numbering in the tens of thousands. The economic implications were enormous. Standardized pottery meant standardized measures. A jar made on a wheel to hold 5 liters would be the same size as every other 5-liter jar, making it possible to measure grain and oil accurately, to calculate taxes and rations, to conduct commerce with confidence that the containers themselves represented reliable units of volume. This might seem trivial, but standardization is foundational to complex economies. You can't have market exchange without agreed measures. You can't have large-scale administration without the ability to count and compare quantities accurately. The potter's wheel wasn't just a technological innovation. It was an enabling technology for urban civilization, creating the material infrastructure that made Sumerian cities economically viable. And the pottery itself tells stories that survive 5,000 years later. The forms change through time, allowing archaeologists to date sites by their ceramic assemblages, to track cultural connections through shared pottery styles, to reconstruct trade networks through the distribution of distinctive wares. The pottery from Uruk appears at sites across Mesopotamia and beyond, sometimes as trade goods, sometimes as evidence of Uruk colonization or influence, spreading the urban template that Sumerian cities pioneered. Egyptian pottery of the pre-dynastic period shows its own evolution, its own stylistic development, but it's largely hand-built until around 2800 BCE, when wheel-made pottery begins appearing, possibly inspired by Mesopotamian examples, possibly by independent invention, but definitely later, following a pattern established in Mesopotamia 500 years earlier. Those 5 centuries matter. During that half-millennium, Mesopotamian potters produced hundreds of millions of vessels, created an entire material culture of standardized containers that supported the first urban civilizations. The workshops became specialized, some potters focusing on fine ware for elite consumption, while others mass-produced utilitarian vessels for commercial use. The kilns grew larger and more sophisticated, achieving higher firing temperatures and more consistent results. The clay sources were exploited systematically, different clay bodies developed for different vessel types, technical knowledge accumulated about how to prepare clay, how to control firing, how to achieve specific colors and textures in the finished product. When Egypt finally adopted the potter's wheel, they inherited not just the tool but centuries of accumulated knowledge about how to use it effectively. Knowledge that Mesopotamian potters had developed through generations of experimentation and refinement. The potter's wheel spread from Mesopotamia across the ancient world, carried by trade and cultural diffusion into Egypt, the Indus Valley, Europe, eventually reaching every civilization that produced pottery. It remains in use today, essentially unchanged in basic principle from the wheels Sumerian potters used 5,500 years ago, testament to the perfection of the original design. Simple innovations that solve fundamental problems don't need improvement, just replication. The potter's wheel was one of those innovations, and it came from Sumer, from the same culture that gave us writing and cities and systematic law and mathematical astronomy, the same people who built civilization while the rest of the world was still figuring out what civilization could be. When Leonard Woolley began excavating Ur in 1922, he was searching for Abraham's city, the biblical Ur of the Chaldees. What he found was older, stranger, more magnificent than anyone had imagined. The royal cemetery yielded evidence of human sacrifice, elaborate burial customs, treasures that spoke of wealth and sophistication contemporary with Egypt's early dynasties. But beneath the royal tombs, beneath the temples, beneath everything that could be called historical, Woolley found the Ubaid layers, the settlements that predated Sumerian civilization itself. and he realized he was looking at a cultural continuity stretching back 5,000 years before his time, 7,000 years before ours. The excavation of Ur was sponsored by the British Museum and the University of Pennsylvania, one of those grand archaeological expeditions that characterized early 20th century archaeology. Massive undertakings employing hundreds of local workers supervised by a small team of European archaeologists. Woolley directed the work from 1922 through 1934, 12 seasons of digging that revealed one of the most important archaeological sites in Mesopotamia, a city whose occupation stretched from the Ubaid period through the Persian conquest, spanning 5,000 years of continuous habitation. The sheer depth of the tell, the artificial hill built from successive generations of mud brick buildings collapsing and being rebuilt, represented cultural accumulation on a scale that few sites could match. The Royal Cemetery was the spectacular discovery, the find that captured public imagination and filled museum galleries with treasures that still dazzle visitors. 16 tombs from around 2600 BCE, burials of kings and queens accompanied into death by entire retinues of attendants who apparently took poison and died beside their rulers, frozen in positions of service for eternity. The practice horrified modern sensibilities and remains controversial among scholars who debate whether the attendants were willing participants in ritual death or coerced victims of royal power. But the treasures were unambiguous evidence of wealth and craft sophistication. The gold helmets and lyres and jewellery that we've already discussed, objects that rewrote understanding of what early dynastic Mesopotamia could achieve. But Woolley kept digging, pushing down through the cemetery levels into earlier occupation and what he found beneath revolutionized understanding of Mesopotamian chronology. The thick layer of water-laid clay that he interpreted as flood deposit, separating Ubaid from later material, suggested to him that the biblical flood might have historical reality. Subsequent scholarship has been more cautious, recognizing that Mesopotamia experienced many floods, and that Woolley's flood layer was probably a localized inundation rather than the apocalyptic deluge of mythology. But beneath the flood layer, beneath the disruption, the Ubaid settlements continued, pottery and architecture marking continuous occupation, stretching back into the 6th millennium BCE. The Ubaid materials forced recalibration of Mesopotamian chronology. Before Woolley's excavations, scholarly understanding of Sumerian history went back perhaps to 3500 BCE, to the Uruk period when cities first appeared. The Ubaid pushed everything back another 2,000 years, revealing that the cultural foundations of Sumerian civilization were far older than anyone had imagined. The temples at Eridu that we discussed earlier, with their 18 successive building levels stretching back to the 6th millennium, fit into this revised chronology, showing religious continuity across millennia that made the pyramids seem almost modern by comparison. Woolley understood what he was seeing. His excavation reports describe the dawning realization that Mesopotamian civilization had depths that scholarly consensus hadn't recognized, that the cities everyone knew from cuneiform texts and later historical records were actually late developments in a cultural tradition stretching back into the Neolithic. He compared the stratigraphic sequence to a history book written in mud brick, each layer a chapter, the whole tell a complete narrative of human cultural development from village to city to empire across 5,000 years of continuous occupation. The pottery changed, the architecture evolved, the economy grew more complex, but the thread of continuity never broke, showing that Ur had been inhabited continuously from the Ubaid period through Persian times, that people had lived on this spot, maintained this settlement, rebuilt their houses and temples generation after generation across a span of time longer than all of recorded Western history. The archaeological methods Woolley pioneered at Ur became standard practice. His careful stratigraphic excavation and detailed recording setting standards that subsequent excavations would follow. He trained local workers to recognize different soil types and pottery styles, creating a workforce that could excavate systematically rather than just digging for treasures. He photographed everything, drew plans and sections, published detailed reports that made the excavation accessible to scholars worldwide. The treasures were spectacular, but the real achievement was the stratigraphic sequence, the chronology that pushed Mesopotamian civilization back into deep time and revealed cultural continuity across millennia. That was Woolley's gift to archaeology. Proof written in mud, brick and pottery sherds that civilization was older and stranger than anyone had dared imagine, that beneath every ancient city there were earlier cities, and beneath those earlier settlements still, all the way back to the first villages where humans learned that they could stay in one place and build something permanent. When radiocarbon dating became available in the mid-20th century, it confirmed what archaeologists had suspected from stratigraphy, but couldn't prove with absolute certainty. The Mesopotamian sites were older than the Egyptian monuments, sometimes by thousands of years. Samples from Eridu's earliest levels dated to the late 7th millennium BCE. The pyramids, built in the mid-3rd millennium BCE, were literally constructed in a world where Sumerian civilization was already ancient history. The numbers don't lie, can't be adjusted to fit comfortable narratives. The Sumerians were first. Willard Libby developed radiocarbon dating in the late 1940s, discovering that organic materials absorb radioactive carbon-14 during life, and that this isotope decays at a predictable rate after death, creating a natural clock that could measure age for anything that was once alive up to about 50,000 years in the past. The technique revolutionized archaeology, transforming a discipline that had relied on relative chronologies and educated guesses into a science that could assign absolute dates to ancient materials. When the method was applied to Mesopotamian sites in the 1950s and 60s, the results were shocking to scholars who had assumed Egyptian civilization was the oldest, or at least contemporary with Mesopotamia's earliest developments. Samples of charcoal from Eridu's earliest occupation levels, from those simple reed structures that mark the beginning of the temple sequence, return dates clustering around 6500 BCE, some even earlier, pushing back into the late 7th millennium. These weren't single anomalous dates that might be dismissed as contamination or error. These were consistent results from multiple samples, from different excavation contexts, all telling the same story. Eridu had been continuously occupied since the Neolithic, since a time when Egypt was still thousands of years away from developing anything resembling urban civilization. The dates were calibrated against tree ring chronologies, refined through improved techniques as the technology developed, and they held. 6500 BCE, give or take a few centuries, for the earliest permanent settlement at Eridu. Compare that to the Great Pyramid, built around 2560 BCE, according to astronomical alignment and historical records. The time gap is over 4,000 years. 4 millennia separate the founding of Eridu from the construction of Egypt's most famous monument. To put that in perspective, 4,000 years before our present day takes us back to around 2000 BCE, to the time of Abraham and the Middle Bronze Age, to an ancient world that feels impossibly remote from modern life. That's how old Eridu was when the pyramids were built. The Sumerians looking at their own past would have seen the same temporal distance we see looking back at the pyramids, maybe more. The radiocarbon dates from other Mesopotamian sites confirmed the pattern. Ubaid pottery, that distinctive painted ware that marked the cultural horizon predating Sumerian civilization, dated consistently to the 6th and 5th millennia BCE. Uruk's earliest levels, the proto-urban settlements that preceded the true city, dated to the late 5th millennium and early 4th millennium BCE, contemporary with Egypt's pre-dynastic period, but showing far more advanced development, already moving toward urbanism while Egypt was still essentially Neolithic. The early dynastic period in Mesopotamia, when Sumerian city-states were flourishing and competing for dominance, was contemporary with Egypt's early dynasties and the first pyramids. But the Sumerian cities that thrived during this period had already been inhabited for thousands of years, built on cultural foundations that stretched back into deep time. The numbers don't lie. They can't be massaged to fit preconceptions about Egypt as the cradle of civilization. They can't be adjusted to make Western narratives about cultural origins more comfortable or more flattering to European assumptions about where civilization began. The radiocarbon dates, confirmed by multiple labs using multiple samples from multiple sites, all point to the same conclusion. Mesopotamian civilization was older than Egyptian civilization by a margin measured in millennia, not centuries. This doesn't diminish Egyptian achievement. The pyramids remain magnificent. The hieroglyphic writing remains brilliant. The cultural contributions of pharaonic Egypt remain foundational to Western civilization. But the priority belongs to Sumer, and the scientific evidence proves it beyond reasonable doubt. As dating techniques improved through the late 20th century, as thermoluminescence dating of pottery and optically, stimulated luminescence dating of sediment supplemented radiocarbon methods, the chronology became even more precise. The Ubaid period could be subdivided into phases, each dated with increasing accuracy. The transition from Ubaid to Uruk, that crucial moment when villages became cities, could be pinpointed to around 3800 BCE. The invention of writing could be dated with confidence to around 3200 BCE in Uruk, a century before comparable developments in Egypt. Every refinement in dating technology confirmed what Woolley had suspected when he dug through the stratigraphic layers at Ur. Mesopotamian civilization had depths that no one had fully appreciated, roots that went back into a past so remote it made everything that came after seem almost modern by comparison. Both cultures built monumental structures reaching toward heaven, but they did it for different reasons, with different meanings. The Egyptian pyramid was a tomb, a house for eternity, a machine for transforming the pharaoh into a god. The Sumerian ziggurat was a temple platform, a meeting place between earth and heaven, a house for the god to descend into. The pyramid sealed off the dead king from the world. The ziggurat invited the divine into the human realm. These are fundamentally different theological statements, and the ziggurat tradition was already established when Egypt was just beginning to imagine permanent architecture. The pyramid's purpose was preservation, protection, eternal housing for the royal body that needed to remain intact for the afterlife journey. The internal chambers were hidden, accessed through passages that would be sealed after burial, concealed so completely that grave robbers would struggle for millennia to find them. The pyramids were meant to endure forever, massive piles of stone that defied time and decay, creating spaces so protected that the pharaoh's body and grave goods would remain undisturbed until the king needed them in the afterlife. The geometry was precise, the alignments astronomical, but the focus was always inward, toward the burial chamber, toward the dead king who dwelled at the heart of the stone mountain. The ziggurat was entirely different in conception and function. It had no burial chambers, no hidden spaces, no attempt to seal anything away from the world. Instead, it was open, accessible, a platform that elevated the temple toward heaven so that the distance between earth and sky could be bridged more easily. The god didn't live in the ziggurat permanently. The god lived in heaven, but would descend to the summit temple during festivals and ritual occasions, meeting with priests who climb the staircases to perform ceremonies that maintain the relationship between human and divine. The ziggurat was architecture as invitation, as bridge, as meeting place between realms that were normally separate. The theological implications are profound. Egyptian religion, at least during the Old Kingdom when the pyramids were built, was focused on death and immortality, on transforming the pharaoh from human to divine through the mechanisms of mummification, ritual, and monumental architecture. The pyramid was the engine of that transformation, the physical structure that facilitated apotheosis. Sumerian religion was more concerned with the relationship between living humans and active gods, with maintaining the cosmic order through proper ritual, with ensuring that the gods remained favorably disposed toward their human servants. The ziggurat wasn't about death or transformation, it was about ongoing relationship, about creating physical space where that relationship could be maintained and renewed. And the ziggurat tradition was older. The temple platforms at Eridu, those successive building levels that kept raising the sacred space higher above the surrounding settlement, dated back to the 6th millennium BCE, thousands of years before the first pyramid. The tradition developed gradually, each generation building the temple platform a bit higher, adding more elaborate architecture, refining the proportions and alignments, until the ziggurat emerged as the perfected form, the ultimate expression of an architectural idea that had been developing for millennia. When Ur-Nammu built his ziggurat at Ur around 2100 BCE, he was working within a building tradition that was already 3,000 years old, maintaining continuity with ancestors who had first decided that sacred space needed to be elevated, set apart, positioned between earth and heaven. The Egyptian pyramids developed quickly, going from the step pyramid of Djoser around 2650 BCE to the perfected form of Khufu's Great Pyramid less than a century later. This rapid development suggests either extraordinary innovation or learning from existing models. The step pyramid itself seems reminiscent of Mesopotamian ziggurats, a stepped structure rising toward heaven, though Djoser's monument served Egyptian purposes rather than Mesopotamian ones. Whether this represents direct influence or convergent evolution remains debated, but the fact remains that Mesopotamia had been building stepped temple platforms for thousands of years before Egypt started experimenting with pyramid construction. The architectural differences reflect different worldviews, different answers to fundamental questions about the relationship between human and divine, between life and death, between earth and heaven. Both cultures created magnificent monuments. Both pushed the boundaries of what was architecturally possible with the materials and tools available to them. But the pyramid and the ziggurat served different purposes, embodied different theologies, represented different understandings of what monumental architecture should achieve. And the ziggurat tradition was older, more developed, refined through millennia of building and rebuilding, before Egypt began constructing its pyramids on the Giza Plateau. Here's the question that keeps archaeologists awake. Did Egypt learn from Mesopotamia, or did both civilizations independently develop writing, mathematics, astronomy, monumental architecture, and urban planning? The evidence suggests some contact, some trade, some transmission of ideas across the ancient Near East. Egyptian cylinder seals show Mesopotamian influence. Some early Egyptian architectural techniques seem borrowed from Mesopotamian prototypes, but the development is largely independent. Two different approaches to similar problems, two different solutions to the challenge of organizing large populations and preserving knowledge across generations. What makes it remarkable is that Mesopotamia had a 2,000-year head start. The evidence for contact is real but limited. Mesopotamian cylinder seals appear in Egypt during the pre-dynastic period, either as actual imports or as Egyptian-made copies of Mesopotamian designs. These seals served administrative functions in both cultures, used to mark ownership of goods and authenticity of documents, and the appearance of the cylinder seal form in Egypt suggests some kind of knowledge transfer from Mesopotamia, where the technology had been in use for centuries. Early Egyptian architectural features, particularly the niched facade decoration visible on some pre-dynastic and early dynastic structures, closely resemble Mesopotamian architectural traditions, suggesting either direct influence or shared aesthetic that developed through cultural contact. But the evidence stops short of proving wholesale borrowing or colonization. Egyptian hieroglyphs, while appearing about a century after cuneiform, are fundamentally different in structure and execution, suggesting independent invention inspired by the concept of writing rather than direct adaptation of Mesopotamian script. Egyptian mathematics used different systems than Mesopotamian base 60 calculations, arriving at different solutions to similar problems. Egyptian religious thought developed along different lines, creating different myths, different theological frameworks, different relationships between gods and humans. Egypt and Mesopotamia both became literate, urban, mathematically sophisticated civilizations, but they did it in their own ways, creating distinct cultures that happened to solve similar problems during roughly the same historical period. The debate over diffusion versus independent invention has occupied scholars for over a century, and no consensus has emerged because the evidence supports both positions depending on what you emphasize. Yes, there was contact between Egypt and Mesopotamia during the crucial period when both were developing the institutions of civilization. Trade goods moved between regions, probably carrying ideas along with physical objects. Merchants who knew about Mesopotamian cities and writing and administrative techniques would have brought that knowledge to Egypt, and vice versa. The concept that writing was possible, that cities could function, that large populations could be organized and governed, these ideas would have spread through the ancient Near East simply through awareness that Mesopotamia was doing these things successfully. But concept transfer isn't the same as cultural borrowing. Knowing that writing exists doesn't tell you how to create a writing system suited to your language and your aesthetic preferences. Knowing that cities are possible doesn't tell you how to organize urban populations in your specific environmental and social context. Each civilization had to work out the details for themselves, had to develop their own solutions to the practical problems of maintaining complex societies. Egypt did this brilliantly, creating administrative systems and architectural traditions that were distinctly Egyptian, unmistakably different from Mesopotamian approaches even when solving similar problems. What makes the relationship between Egypt and Mesopotamia fascinating is precisely this combination of parallel development and limited contact. They knew about each other, probably traded with each other through intermediaries, certainly were aware that other complex civilizations existed in the broader Near Eastern world. But they developed largely independently, creating different writing systems, different architectural traditions, different religious frameworks, different solutions to the universal challenges of urban civilization. If they had been in closer contact, if there had been more direct cultural exchange, the civilizations might have become more similar. Instead, they remained distinct, each following its own developmental trajectory. But Mesopotamia started earlier. That 2,000-year head start meant that when Egypt was developing its civilization during the pre-dynastic and early dynastic periods, it was doing so in a world where cities, writing, mathematics, and monumental architecture already existed as proven concepts. The Egyptians didn't have to wonder whether civilization was possible. They knew it was because Mesopotamia had already demonstrated it. Whether this knowledge accelerated Egyptian development, whether it made the process easier or faster than it would have been in complete isolation, remains speculative. But the chronological priority belongs to Mesopotamia, and that matters for understanding how civilization emerged in the ancient world. In temple archives and palace libraries across Mesopotamia, scribes preserved knowledge on clay tablets that have survived 5,000 years because clay, once baked, is almost indestructible. Mathematical tables, astronomical observations, medical texts, literary works, administrative records, personal letters, all of it pressed into soft clay and left to dry in the Mesopotamian sun. The majority of these tablets are still untranslated, sitting in museum storage, waiting for scholars to decipher what the Sumerians thought was important, enough to preserve. Each tablet is a voice from a civilization that predates the pyramids, speaking to us if we'll take the time to listen. The survival rate of clay tablets is extraordinary compared to other ancient writing materials. Papyrus, the writing surface Egyptians preferred, degrades unless conditions are extremely dry, which means most papyri have been lost to time except for those preserved in Egypt's desert climate. Parchment and paper degrade even faster, but clay tablets, especially those that were baked either intentionally or accidentally in the fires that destroyed the buildings housing them, become ceramic, virtually indestructible unless deliberately smashed. The tablets can be broken, certainly, and many are fragmentary, but even broken tablets preserve their texts, and fragments can often be matched and reassembled to recover complete documents. The result is that we have hundreds of thousands of cuneiform tablets in museum collections worldwide, pulled from excavations across Mesopotamia over the past 150 years. The British Museum alone holds over 130,000 tablets. The University of Pennsylvania Museum has 40,000. The Oriental Institute in Chicago has tens of thousands more. Every major museum with Near Eastern collections has storage rooms filled with tablets, boxes and boxes of them, most still unpublished, many still unread since they were excavated decades or even a century ago. Each tablet contains information, knowledge that the ancient scribes considered important enough to preserve in permanent form, and collectively they represent a library of ancient thought that we've barely begun to explore. The contents vary enormously. Many tablets are administrative, recording economic transactions, temple offerings, commercial contracts, legal disputes. These seem mundane, but they're actually treasure troves of information about daily life in ancient Mesopotamia, about economic systems and social relationships, and the practical details of how cities functioned. Other tablets preserve literature, the Epic of Gilgamesh, the Epic of Atrahasis, the Descent of Inanna, hymns to various gods, wisdom literature, proverbs, and literary compositions that showcase the Sumerian and Akkadian languages at their most sophisticated. Mathematical tablets demonstrate calculation techniques and preserve tables that students memorize during scribal training. Astronomical tablets record planetary observations and eclipse predictions. Medical tablets describe symptoms and treatments, preserving ancient pharmaceutical knowledge. Personal letters survive on tablets, offering intimate glimpses into ancient lives. A merchant writing to his business partner about a delayed shipment. A son writing to his father asking for money. A wife complaining about her mother-in-law. These letters are poignant in their humanity, showing that people 5,000 years ago worried about the same things we worry about, dealt with the same family dramas, experienced the same frustrations with work and relationships. The clay preserved not just the official records of kings and temples, but also these personal moments, voices from the past speaking with immediacy across vast spans of time. The challenge is translation. Reading cuneiform requires years of training, learning not just the script but the languages it was used to write, primarily Sumerian and Akkadian, but also Hittite, Elamite, Hurrian, and others. Sumerian is particularly difficult, an isolated language unrelated to any modern tongue, with grammatical structures that are alien to speakers of Indo-European or Semitic languages. The number of scholars capable of reading Sumerian fluently has never been large, and many tablets require specialist knowledge not just in language but in specific domains like mathematics, astronomy, or medicine. A mathematical tablet might be easy to read in terms of recognizing the cuneiform signs, but impossible to understand without knowledge of ancient mathematical notation and techniques. This means the majority of tablets remain untranslated, waiting for scholars to have time and funding to work through them systematically. Each year brings new publications, new translations, new insights into Mesopotamian culture, but the pace is slow relative to the size of the corpus. There are tablets sitting in museum storage that haven't been examined since they were excavated in the 1920s or 30s, that contain information about Sumerian civilization that no modern person has read. These are voices waiting to speak, knowledge waiting to be recovered, pieces of the puzzle of ancient Mesopotamia that could change our understanding of how civilization developed and what the Sumerians achieved. And the preservation continues. Even as these tablets sit in museums, they remain readable, their cuneiform signs as clear as the day they were pressed into clay. Given proper storage conditions, they'll remain readable for thousands more years, outlasting our books and computers and digital storage media. The Sumerians, whether intentionally or accidentally, chose the most durable writing medium humans have ever used. Their knowledge, pressed into clay and baked hard, has survived the fall of their civilization, the extinction of their language, the forgetting of their script, and it will continue to survive as long as museums preserve the tablets and scholars maintain the ability to read cuneiform. These are voices from before the pyramids, speaking across 5 millennia, if we'll take the time to listen. So what does it mean that the Sumerians were older, more advanced, more sophisticated than we teach in school? It means the story of civilization isn't a simple progression from primitive to advanced, isn't a clean narrative of Egypt giving birth to Western culture. It means the roots go deeper, spread wider, tangle through cultures we've barely begun to understand. It means that when the pyramids were being built, the Sumerians were already preserving knowledge from cities that had fallen into ruin, already treating their own past as ancient history, already aware that civilizations rise and fall, and the only hope of preserving what matters is to press it into clay and hope someone in the future will remember how to read. The conventional narrative taught in schools tends to present Egypt as the beginning, the cradle of civilization from which Western culture ultimately descends. This narrative is comfortable, familiar, aligned with classical sources that emphasized Egypt and downplayed or ignored Mesopotamia. The Greeks knew Egypt, visited its monuments, marveled at its age, and incorporated Egyptian wisdom into their own cultural narratives. They knew less about Mesopotamia, had less direct contact with the region, and so the Sumerian contribution to civilization got buried, forgotten, relegated to footnotes while Egypt received the attention and the credit. But the archaeological record doesn't support this narrative. It shows us that Mesopotamia developed cities, writing, mathematics, astronomy, law, literature, and monumental architecture first, often by margins measured in millennia. It shows us that the Sumerians had already been refining these civilizational technologies for thousands of years, while Egypt was still developing the foundations of complex society. It shows us that the timeline we've been taught is wrong, that the conventional story of civilization's origins needs revision to account for discoveries made over the past 150 years of Mesopotamian archaeology. This revision isn't about replacing Egypt with Mesopotamia in some kind of competitive ranking of ancient civilizations. Both cultures were brilliant. Both made contributions to human development that remain foundational to this day. But the historical record should be accurate. The timeline should reflect what actually happened, rather than what fits comfortably with inherited narratives about cultural origins. And what happened was that Mesopotamia came first, developed the template for civilization, and established the base technologies that Egypt and other cultures would later adopt, adapt, and perfect in their own ways. The depth of Sumerian civilization becomes almost vertiginous when you really contemplate it. When the third dynasty of Ur was flourishing around 2100 BCE, when Ur-Nammu was issuing his law code and building his ziggurat, the Sumerians were already preserving texts copied from sources that were 1,000 years old. They are maintaining temples built on foundations laid 2,000 years earlier. They were using astronomical observations compiled from records spanning centuries. They understood that their civilization was ancient, that they stood at the end of a long chain of cultural transmission, stretching back into a past that blurred into mythology and legend. The king list, with its antediluvian kings, wasn't just mythology. It was the Sumerians' attempt to grapple with their own antiquity, to explain to themselves how their civilization could be so old, how the cultural continuity could stretch back so far that the beginning was lost in mythic time. They knew they were ancient. They felt the weight of that antiquity, the responsibility of preserving knowledge from cities that had risen and fallen before their own time. The flood narrative served as an explanation for discontinuity, for the gaps in knowledge, for the sense that something had been lost that could never fully be recovered, and they preserved what they could. They copied ancient texts onto new tablets, so the knowledge wouldn't be lost when old tablets crumbled. They maintained temples on ancient foundations, rebuilding in the same sacred locations their ancestors had used. They taught scribes to read Sumerian even after Akkadian became the spoken language, preserving their linguistic heritage across cultural change. They understood, perhaps more clearly than any civilization before or since, that knowledge is fragile, that cultural memory can be lost, that the only defense against oblivion is to write everything down and hope that future generations will remember how to read it. We stand now at the receiving end of that hope. The Sumerians pressed their knowledge into clay 5,000 years ago, preserved it through the collapse of their civilization, through the forgetting of their language, through millennia of burial beneath the sands of Iraq, and now, slowly, painfully, through the work of archaeologists and linguists and historians, we're recovering that knowledge, reading what they wrote, understanding what they preserved. We're discovering that the story of civilization is older and more complex than we ever imagined, that the roots go back further than any classical source suggested, that the Sumerians were first and that their achievement was extraordinary. The pyramids still stand on the Giza plateau, magnificent monuments to Egyptian ambition and skill. But beneath the earth of southern Iraq the tells still rise, artificial hills built from 5,000 years of continuous habitation, each layer representing another chapter in the story of human civilization. Somewhere in those tells, in tablets still waiting to be excavated or sitting untranslated in museum storage, are more pieces of the puzzle, more voices from the past speaking across millennia, more evidence of how extraordinary the Sumerians were and how much we owe to a civilization that flourished and fell thousands of years before our own history began. And so, as you drift towards sleep tonight, somewhere in the darkness between dream and history, consider those Sumerian scribes pressing warnings and wisdom into wet clay by lamplight 5,000 years ago, knowing they would never see the future they were trying to preserve. They wrote for us, for people they couldn't imagine, in languages we almost forgot how to read, trusting that someone, someday, would care enough to listen. The tablets rest in museum cases now, behind protective glass, their cuneiform mark still holding questions we're only beginning to answer. The tells rise from the Iraqi desert, artificial hills built from millennia of human occupation, each layer a generation, each brick a choice to stay, to build, to continue what came before. The temples have crumbled, the cities fallen silent, the language extinct, but the knowledge remains, patient as stone, waiting for the moment we're ready to understand what our ancestors were truly saying. We think of the pyramids as ancient, and they are monuments that have stood for over 4,000 years, defying time and decay. But beneath them, chronologically if not geographically, the Sumerians were already ancient, already preserving knowledge from cities that had fallen into ruin, already aware that civilizations rise and fall, and the only immortality is what you press into clay, and hope survives the next catastrophe. You're connected to them across time, part of the same human story of watching, wondering, and trying to understand the mysteries written in the heavens and buried in the earth. The same stars they tracked with such intensity still wheel overhead. The same questions that drove them to build cities and temples still drive us to explore, to discover, to preserve. We're all trying to leave something permanent in a world where everything eventually turns to dust. So let yourself drift now into the same darkness those ancient astronomers watched, under the same moon that illuminated their ziggurat steps. The clay tablets will still be there tomorrow, patient and permanent, holding their secrets. The tells will still rise from the desert, marking where civilization began. And somewhere in the space between sleep and waking, you might hear them, those voices from before the pyramids, whispering across 5,000 years that they remember, that they preserved,